Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I noticed the first smooth tree at 6:45 on a Monday morning, about 20 minutes after I left the forestry track. I worked for a private woodland company in Northumberland, mostly checking storm damage, marking trees, and inspecting fences before the cutting crews came through. That part of the forest sat west of Kielder Water, well away from the visitor trails. In winter, I could spend a full day out there without seeing another person. It had frozen overnight. The ground was hard, and a thin layer of mist hung between the trees. There had been no snow, but white frost covered the bracken and the fallen branches. I was walking toward compartment 42 when I saw a strip of gray on a spruce trunk. At first, I thought someone had sprayed paint on it. The mark started near the ground and ran upward higher than I could reach. It was about 30 centimeters wide, with edges so straight they looked measured. When I got closer, I saw it was not paint. The bark was gone along that strip. The exposed surface did not look like fresh wood. It was smooth, dry, and gray, almost like concrete. There were no cuts, chips, or torn fibers around the edges. The normal rough bark simply ended, and the flat gray surface began. I touched it with my glove. It was warmer than the rest of the trunk. Not warm exactly, but it had none of the freezing dampness of the bark around it. I took off my glove and pressed my fingertips against it. The surface felt very smooth, with a faint vibration underneath. I thought it might have been a machine operating somewhere in the forest, though I could not hear an engine. The strip continued around the back of the tree. I stepped to the other side. Another spruce about 6 meters away had the same gray mark. So did the tree behind that one. The marks lined up perfectly. I walked between them and found that every trunk along the same direction had been changed. The affected area formed a narrow corridor, maybe 3 meters wide, running northeast through the forest. Anything inside that corridor had the same smooth gray surface facing the line. Trees, fallen logs, even a wooden fence post. Outside it, everything looked normal. I called my supervisor, Gareth Lowe. He answered from the depot and sounded busy. I told him someone had damaged a group of trees in compartment 41. What kind of damage? I tried to explain the smooth bark. He asked if it was machinery scrape from a harvester. I said there were no tire tracks and no recent work scheduled there. He told me to photograph it and continue the inspection. He said he would look at the pictures when I returned. I took several photos with my work phone. The gray strips showed clearly, but the camera made them look flatter and less strange. In person, they seemed slightly darker in the center, as if the surface continued deeper into the trunk than it should have. I followed the corridor. It ran straight downhill through dense spruce without bending around anything. On larger trees, only the section within the corridor was affected. On smaller saplings, the entire trunk had turned gray. About 50 meters in, the line crossed a drainage ditch. The mud at the bottom was frozen. No footprints or tire marks crossed it. A fallen tree lay across the corridor. Its trunk was thick enough that I had to climb over it. The bark had turned smooth in a narrow band exactly where the invisible line passed through. The wood beneath the gray section felt different when I tapped it. The normal part made a dull wooden knock. The gray part made a higher sound, almost metallic. I recorded that on my phone. When I played it back, both taps sounded the same. The corridor continued up the next slope. That was where I started feeling uneasy. A machine could have moved in a straight path, but there was no physical path. The grass, moss, and dead branches on the ground had not been crushed. The line climbed over rocks and through tangled windfall without leaving any disturbance except for the surfaces facing it. A large boulder stood near the top of the slope. One side of it had turned smooth and gray too. The stone was normally dark sandstone, rough and covered in lichen. Inside the corridor, the lichen ended in a straight vertical edge. The rock surface beyond it looked polished. I ran my hand over it. The faint vibration was stronger there. I could also hear a low sound, but only when I leaned close. It reminded me of air moving through a pipe. I stepped away. The sound stopped. I tried calling Gareth again. My phone showed no signal. That was not unusual in the forest, but the company radios usually worked through repeaters. I pressed the transmit button. Unit 4 to base. Static came back. Then I heard my own voice repeat, Unit 4 to base. The words were faint and slower than I had spoken them. I tried again. This time there was only a soft clicking sound. 3 clicks, a pause, then 2. I switched the radio off. The clicking continued for another second through the speaker before stopping. I should have gone back then. The corridor was not part of my assigned inspection, and I had already taken enough pictures to report it. Instead, I kept following it because I wanted to find where it ended. I checked my watch. 6:58. I had been walking for about 13 minutes. The corridor crossed another forestry road. The gravel showed no mark, but the wooden posts on both sides had smooth sections at the same height. On the far side, the line entered older trees where the ground dropped sharply toward a stream. The mist was thicker there. Sound did not travel properly in that part of the wood. I could see branches moving above me, but I heard no wind. My boots struck frozen ground, yet each step seemed quieter than the last. A roe deer stood between 2 trees ahead. It faced across the corridor, not toward me. Its ears were raised and its body looked tense. I stopped. The deer took 1 step forward, placed its front hoof near the edge of the gray strip on a fallen branch, and pulled back. It turned its head slowly, following something along the corridor toward the northeast. There was nothing visible. Then it ran downhill, crashing through the brush. The sound of it faded almost immediately. I carried on more slowly. The smooth sections became wider. At first, the corridor had been about 3 meters across. After another 100 meters, it was closer to 4. The edges remained perfectly straight, but the trees inside it showed larger gray areas. Some of the marks had fine lines running through them. The lines were shallow and curved, like fingerprints enlarged across the bark. They all bent in the same direction toward the far end of the corridor. I used my pocket knife to scrape one. The blade left no mark. I pressed harder. The tip slipped and cut my glove, but the gray surface remained smooth. I tried the normal bark beside it. The knife lifted a piece easily. The exposed wood underneath was pale and damp. At the boundary between the normal wood and the gray area, the layers did not join properly. The gray part seemed to begin inside the tree, not on top of it. A drop of sap formed near the cut. Instead of running downward, it moved sideways toward the gray section. It reached the edge and disappeared. I backed away from the tree. The mist shifted across the corridor in a straight sheet. It did not drift between the trunks normally. It moved along the line, staying inside the affected strip. Frost lifted from the ground in tiny pieces and traveled with it. The low vibration returned. This time I felt it through my boots. I checked my watch again. 7:06. My phone showed 7:11. I assumed the watch had started running slow in the cold. It was an old analog model, and that had happened before. I tapped the face. The second hand moved normally. The corridor crossed the stream without changing direction. The water was shallow and fast, with ice around the edges. A group of stones in the center had smooth gray bands across them. The bands lined up from one bank to the other. I stepped onto the stones. Halfway across, the vibration grew strong enough that the water around my boots formed tight circular ripples. The stream noise faded. For a few seconds, I could see water rushing over the rocks, but heard nothing. Then a sharp crack came from the trees behind me. I turned. A spruce branch had broken and fallen across the corridor. It landed partly inside the affected strip. As I watched, the bark on the branch began changing. The color drained slowly from brown to gray. The rough scales flattened. It happened from one edge of the corridor to the other, taking maybe 10 seconds. Nothing touched it. I stepped off the stones and moved quickly uphill. The ground beyond the stream was steep, but the corridor ignored the slope. It went straight up through young pines, crossed a stone wall, and continued into an open area where trees had been cut years earlier. The wall had a smooth channel through it. Individual stones were still in place. Nothing had been broken or moved. Their exposed faces had simply turned flat and gray along the line. In the clearing, the corridor became easier to see. Frost covered most of the grass, but inside the strip, the ground was dark and dry. It formed a straight path across the open space toward another stand of trees nearly half a mile from where I had started. I looked back. The line behind me disappeared into the mist, perfectly straight through every obstacle. My phone signal returned briefly. I called Gareth. The call connected, but I heard only static. Then his voice said, "Where are you?" I answered that I was north of compartment 41, following the damage. There was a long delay. His voice returned. "You haven't left the track." I told him I was nearly half a mile into the forest. He repeated, "You haven't left the track." The words sounded exactly the same the second time. I looked at the phone. The call timer had stopped at 4 seconds. I ended the call. A message appeared from Gareth almost immediately. "Where are you?" "Your tracker is still at the van." Our work phones transmitted location whenever they had signal. I opened the map. My position marker sat on the forestry road beside my parked vehicle. I could see the open clearing around me, nowhere near the road. I typed a reply, but it would not send. The vibration became a steady hum. At the far end of the clearing, something moved between the trees. It was not a person. It looked more like a narrow section of the background sliding sideways. Trunks bent slightly where it passed, not physically, but visually, as though seen through thick glass. The distortion entered the corridor. It moved toward me. I could not judge its distance. One moment it seemed near the far trees. The next, it looked halfway across the clearing without having crossed the ground between. The dry grass inside the corridor flattened as it approached, not outward or downward. Each blade leaned northeast toward the far end. I moved out of the strip. The moment I crossed the edge, the hum weakened. The distortion stopped. It stood in the corridor opposite me, maybe 30 meters away. The air there looked gray and dense. Behind it, the trees appeared stretched vertically. A pale shape formed near the center. It was roughly oval and no brighter than the mist. Several darker marks moved within it, too vague to identify. I stepped farther away. The distortion resumed moving along the corridor. It passed the place where I had been standing. The temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed on the grass outside the strip while the ground inside remained dry. I watched it continue toward the stream. As it moved away, a row of small branches lifted from the ground and hung in the air behind it for several seconds. Then they dropped. I did not follow. I walked around the clearing, keeping at least 20 meters from the corridor, and headed back using my compass. The compass needle would not settle. It pointed north, then slowly turned toward the gray strip. No matter which way I faced, the needle leaned toward the corridor. I put it away and used the slope and stream to guide myself. The forest seemed unfamiliar away from the line. I had worked there many times, but the trees looked too close together, and several paths ended where I expected them to continue. I heard footsteps behind me twice. They matched mine with a slight delay. When I stopped, they took one extra step. I looked back each time and saw nothing. At one point, I found the same fallen branch I had watched turn gray. I should have been south of it. Instead, I stood on the opposite side of the corridor, facing deeper into the forest. I had crossed the line without remembering it. My watch showed 7:19. My phone showed 7:30. The difference was now 11 minutes. I began walking faster. The corridor behind me made a faint cracking sound, one tree after another, moving in my direction. I did not look back for a while. When I finally did, a dim gray shape stood among the trees. It was tall and narrow, but its outline changed whenever mist passed in front of it. At times it resembled a person facing me. At other times it looked like a gap cut through the forest. It remained exactly inside the corridor. I moved downhill. The shape followed along the straight line, ignoring the terrain. When the corridor crossed higher ground, I saw only its upper section between the trunks. When the land dropped, the whole shape became visible again. It did not seem to walk. It simply stayed at the same distance. I reached the forestry road at 7:47 by my phone. My watch showed 7:36. My van was parked where I had left it. Gareth's pickup stood behind it. He got out as soon as he saw me and asked where I had been. He said he had arrived 12 minutes earlier and found my phone and radio signals showing beside the van, but I was nowhere nearby. I showed him the corridor. From the road, the first gray tree was clearly visible. We walked to it together. The surface was still smooth, but the affected strip ended after 3 trees. Beyond them, the forest looked normal. I told Gareth it had continued for nearly half a mile. He checked the next trunks and found ordinary bark. We followed the direction for about 100 meters. There was no gray corridor, no polished boulder, and no damaged fence post. The drainage ditch was there, but the fallen tree I had climbed over lay 20 meters to one side. Gareth thought I had become disoriented in the mist. Then we reached the stream. The stones still had smooth gray bands across them. He stopped arguing. We did not go farther. By midday, a manager and 2 environmental officers had inspected the area. They found 17 affected trees, the stones in the stream, and 1 section of the wall. The marks did not form a continuous route anymore. Samples came back as normal wood and stone. The gray surfaces darkened over the next week and slowly became rough again. My watch continued running, 11 minutes slow until I replaced the battery. A month later, I returned with Gareth during a clear afternoon. We found no sign of the corridor beyond a few pale marks on the first spruce. Near the far side of the stream, my radio started clicking. 3 clicks, a pause, then 2. Gareth heard it too. Across the slope, a thin gray line appeared on one tree, then the next, moving northeast through the forest. We watched it reach the top of the hill. My watch stopped. Far beyond the trees, something narrow and pale rose above the ridge, held there for several seconds, and lowered out of sight. The shaking started at 4:17 in the afternoon while I was standing in my kitchen rinsing a mug. It was not a big earthquake. The cupboard doors clicked, the hanging light moved, and a few glasses knocked together. I grabbed the counter because the floor seemed to slide sideways for a second. Then everything stopped. I lived on the 5th floor of a 12-story apartment block in Sheffield. The building was called Henshaw Court, though there was nothing court-like about it. It was a plain concrete tower built in the 70s, with narrow balconies and an underground car park that always smelled damp. Earthquakes were unusual there, but not impossible. I had felt one years earlier. That one had been stronger. I checked my phone. No alerts yet. Someone opened a door in the corridor, then another. Voices started outside. I went onto my balcony. The weather had been dull all day. Low gray cloud covered the city, and there had been light rain on and off since morning. The roads below were wet. Traffic moved normally. People were leaning over balconies on several floors. A man above me called down, "Did you feel that?" I said yes. A woman on the building opposite had come outside with a small child. She pointed up at the sky. At first I thought she was showing him a plane. Then I saw the lines. They were very faint, almost the same color as the cloud. They formed a large angular pattern directly above the block. I could not tell whether the lines were made of light or gaps in the cloud. They were pale and straight, meeting at sharp corners. The pattern looked flat at first, like a drawing laid across the sky. It had 6 sides, but not a regular shape. Smaller lines crossed inside it, creating triangles and narrow diamond shapes. It moved slowly from west to east. The clouds moved south. That was the first thing that made it feel wrong. I heard someone on a lower balcony say, "What is that?" The pattern continued across the cloud without changing shape. It did not brighten or fade. It looked as though something beneath the cloud was projecting through it, though there was no visible beam from the ground. I took out my phone and recorded. On the screen, I saw ordinary gray cloud. I lowered the phone. The pattern was still there. I tried again, adjusting the exposure. The camera showed nothing except cloud and the edge of the balcony above me. A woman named Priya lived 2 doors down. She came onto her balcony holding her own phone. "Can you see it?" she asked. I said yes. She looked relieved. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The pattern changed as it moved. One long side folded inward, though the shape remained flat. I knew folded did not make sense, but that was how it looked. A line rotated without crossing the others, and the triangles inside became a row of connected squares. The movement was slow and smooth. There was no flashing. No sound came from the sky. The city below stayed normal. Cars stopped at the lights. A bus turned at the junction. A man walked across the pavement carrying shopping bags. The pattern passed above the roof of Henshaw Court. As it crossed directly overhead, I felt pressure in my ears. It was mild, like descending in a lift. I swallowed, but the feeling remained. Several pigeons lifted from a nearby warehouse and flew in a tight circle. They did not scatter. They kept circling beneath the pattern as if they could not decide where to go. Then the shape seemed to tilt. The left edge became narrow, while the right side widened. For a moment it looked three-dimensional, like a large frame turning in the cloud. A pale oval appeared in the center. That was the brightest part, though it still did not look like a light. It looked more like the cloud had been thinned in one exact area. I heard glass break somewhere below. The shaking had already stopped, so I looked down. A plant pot had fallen from a balcony and smashed in the courtyard. Nobody was near it. When I looked back up, the pattern had moved east of the building. It became fainter over the next minute, then disappeared into the overcast sky. The pressure in my ears stopped. The pigeons flew away. People remained on their balconies. Priya asked if I had managed to record it. I checked the video. The footage showed the sky, the cloud, and her voice asking whether I could see it. The shape was not visible. She checked hers. Same thing. My phone said the video lasted 38 seconds. I had been outside for at least 5 minutes. The time at the top of the screen was 4:26. I had looked at it in the kitchen immediately after the shaking, and it had shown 4:17. The earthquake and everything afterward had not felt like 9 minutes, but I could not be certain. A few minutes later, the building manager came over the intercom and asked residents to check for damage. He said the lifts had stopped as a precaution and engineers were being contacted. I went into the corridor. My neighbor across the hall, Martin Shaw, was inspecting a crack above his front door. It was old, but he said it looked wider. I asked if he had seen the sky. He said, "The shape?" I nodded. He went inside and came back with an envelope and a pen. Without saying much, he drew what he had seen. His drawing matched the pattern almost exactly. 6 uneven outer sides, 3 lines crossing through the center, a small oval slightly off-center. I pointed at the oval. That was in the middle. Not from where I was standing, he said. It was lower down. He had watched from the north stairwell window, so his angle had been different. Priya joined us. Martin showed her the drawing. She went quiet. "I drew that already," she said. She brought us into her flat and showed us a page from her daughter's school notebook. She had drawn the same general shape, but her version had the oval near the upper corner. The line pattern inside was identical to Martin's. They had not spoken before drawing it. I had not drawn anything, but the shape was clear in my head. I took the pen and tried. My version came out almost the same. That bothered me more than the sight itself. I had not been sure how many inner lines there were. I thought I would make mistakes. Instead, my hands seemed to know where they went. Martin put the 3 drawings side by side on Priya's table. The outer edges differed slightly because of our viewpoints. The internal pattern matched. A diagonal line divided the left section. 2 shorter lines made a narrow diamond. The oval sat in a clear space between them. Priya said it looked like a symbol. Martin said it looked like a floor plan. I did not say what it reminded me of. To me, it looked like something viewed from above that had turned while we watched. The local news reported the earthquake at 5. It was a small tremor with an epicenter near the Peak District. No serious damage had been reported. There was no mention of anything in the sky. By 6, people had started sharing messages in the residents' group chat. At least 14 people in our building had seen the pattern. 4 had taken photographs or videos. None showed it. A man on the 9th floor, Yusuf Ahmed, posted a drawing. It was almost identical to ours. A woman named Celia from the 3rd floor posted another. Same lines, same oval. People accused each other of copying, but the timestamps showed some drawings had been made before anyone shared them. The building manager asked everyone to stop posting rumors. At 6:32, the fire alarm activated for less than a second. It gave one short burst and stopped. The lights in my flat dimmed. My television switched on by itself. The screen showed a weather forecast with no sound. The presenter stood in front of a map of northern England. For a moment, the map disappeared. The same pale geometric pattern covered the screen. It was not a clear graphic. It looked faint and uneven, like marks seen through fog. Then the weather map returned. I called Priya. Her television had done the same thing. So had Martin's. None of us had been watching the same channel. I unplugged mine. The screen went black normally. At around 7, I took the stairs down to check my car in the underground garage. The building had been inspected enough for residents to remain inside, but the lifts were still shut down. The stairwell was crowded with people moving up and down. On the 8th floor landing, I passed a boy sitting on the steps with his mother. He was drawing with a green crayon. The paper showed the same shape. His mother saw me looking and covered it with her hand. In the lobby, 2 maintenance workers were checking the walls. One told me there had been no structural damage, only some cracked plaster and a broken pipe in the basement. The underground car park lights flickered as I entered. Water dripped from the ceiling near the far wall. My car looked fine. I was about to leave when I noticed a pale mark on the concrete floor. It was near the center of the car park between 2 rows of spaces. At first, I thought it was paint from old parking lines. Then I saw the shape. 6 uneven sides, thin lines crossing inside, an oval near the middle. The mark was about 4 meters wide. It was not painted. The concrete looked dry inside the lines and damp everywhere else. I walked around it. No water dripped directly above. The inner lines were narrow and precise, no more than 2 centimeters wide. They appeared slightly lighter than the floor. I took a photograph. The image showed wet concrete with no pattern. My phone lost signal. A low vibration started beneath my feet. It was not another earthquake. Nothing shook. The vibration felt steady, like heavy machinery running somewhere below the garage. The lights dimmed one after another from the entrance toward me. I moved back toward the stairwell. The pale lines on the floor became brighter. Not much, just enough to separate them from the concrete. The oval in the center darkened. I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned, nobody was there. The garage had long sight lines. I could see between every parked car. The footsteps continued. They sounded soft and uneven, moving along the far row without any visible person. I hurried toward the exit. The vibration grew stronger. Car alarms began flashing silently. Their lights blinked in different rhythms, but no horns sounded. At the base of the ramp, a shadow moved across the wall. It was tall and narrow. It passed behind a parked van, though there was nothing between the van and the wall that could have cast it. The shadow stopped. Its upper part turned toward me. I ran into the stairwell and pulled the fire door closed. The vibration stopped as soon as the latch caught. The stairwell lights were normal. My phone signal returned. The clock showed 7:24. I had left my flat at 6:58. The trip down 5 floors and across the garage should have taken less than 10 minutes. I went back upstairs without checking the pattern again. Priya was in the corridor when I reached the 5th floor. She said people on the upper floors had heard a humming sound through their radiators. Martin came out holding his phone. He had received a video from Yusuf on the 9th floor. The video showed ordinary clouds above the city, no pattern, but the audio contained a deep, pulsing vibration. Under it, someone whispered numbers. The voice was too faint to identify. Yusuf said nobody had been speaking while he recorded. We listened several times. The numbers sounded like floor levels: 12, 9, 5, ground. Then a pause, then below. Nobody wanted to discuss the garage after I told them what I had seen. The police came around 8 because several residents had reported lights and possible trespassing in the basement. 2 officers checked the car park with the building manager. They found no one. The floor was wet, but the pattern had disappeared. The security cameras showed me entering at 7:02 and leaving at 7:08. According to the footage, I had only been there for 6 minutes. The camera did not show the lights dimming or the car alarms flashing. It also did not show me stopping in the center. I walked straight to my car, checked it, and returned to the stairwell. At 9:15, the lifts came back into service. People gradually went inside and closed their doors. I stayed with Priya and Martin for another hour. We spread the drawings across the table and compared them with ones posted in the group. There were 23 in total. Most came from different floors. The internal lines were nearly identical in every one. Then Priya noticed something. When the drawings were arranged according to the floor where each person had been standing, the oval moved. In drawings from lower floors, it sat near the top of the shape. In drawings from higher floors, it sat near the bottom. Mine, Martin's, and Priya's placed it near the middle because we were all on the 5th floor. It was as though everyone had drawn the same object from different heights. Martin used transparent kitchen paper to trace several versions. When he layered them, the outer edges formed a rough, solid shape, not a flat symbol. a long, uneven structure with an empty oval running through its center. We stopped working on it after that. I went back to my flat before 11. The sky outside was still overcast. The city lights reflected off the cloud in a dull orange glow. Nothing unusual was visible. I locked my balcony door and left the curtains closed. At 2:04 in the morning, I woke because something vibrated beneath my bed. The movement was weak but steady. A glass of water on the bedside table formed small ripples. My phone screen came on. There was no call or message. A pale line appeared across the black display, then another. Within a few seconds, the geometric pattern formed on the screen. The oval was no longer in the center. It sat at the very bottom edge. A small bright point moved through it. The vibration passed upward through the building. I heard cupboards rattling in the flat above. Pipes knocked inside the wall. Somewhere in the corridor, a child began crying. I went to the window and opened the curtain. The clouds looked normal. Then a pale shape moved up the face of the building opposite. It was only visible as a change in the reflected streetlight, a large angular area sliding upward over windows and balconies. As it reached the roof, every light in that building went out. The shape continued into the cloud. The vibration faded. My phone returned to the lock screen. At breakfast time, the residents group filled with new messages. People on 7 different floors had woken at 2:04. Several had seen the same moving shadow. 3 had drawn the pattern again. In those drawings, the oval sat at the bottom. By afternoon, the council had inspected the building and found no fault beneath it. The local camera network had recorded only normal, overcast sky and a brief power dip in the area. I moved out of Henshaw Court 2 months later. On my final day, I carried the last box to my car and crossed the underground garage. The concrete was dry. Near the space where I had seen the pattern, someone had scratched a small shape into the floor. 6 sides, crossing lines, an oval at the bottom. A maintenance worker was standing nearby, replacing a ceiling light. I asked if he had made it. He looked at the mark and shook his head. Then he pointed upward. Directly above it, set into the concrete ceiling, was a narrow oval patch darker than the rest. As we watched, a faint line moved outward from it and formed the first side of the shape. I noticed the shape about 20 minutes after the ferry left Oban. I was standing on the outside deck on the port side, trying to get some air because the passenger lounge was too warm. It was late October, just after 7 in the morning, and the sky had only started to brighten. The sea was dark gray with low clouds sitting on the hills and light rain blowing across the deck. I was traveling to Mull for a plumbing job at a holiday cottage. My van was parked on the lower vehicle deck with my tools inside. I had made the crossing plenty of times and knew roughly where we were supposed to turn between the islands. The object looked like a darker patch under the water, maybe 15 meters from the side of the ferry. At first, I thought it was the shadow of the ship. The deck lights shone onto the water, and the hull made a long black area beside us. But this patch sat outside that shadow. It was oval, longer than a car, and moved at the same speed as the ferry. The water was choppy enough that I kept losing sight of it. Each time a wave passed, the shape disappeared under the broken surface, then returned in exactly the same place. I leaned over the rail. There were no fins, bubbles, or white water. It did not rise or roll like a dolphin. It stayed a few meters below the surface, dark and smooth. A man in a yellow waterproof jacket came outside, carrying a paper cup. He stood near me and lit a cigarette, even though smoking was not allowed in that section. I asked if he could see the dark patch. He looked down. "Probably a seal," he said. "It's a big seal." He watched for a few seconds longer. The shape moved through a bright reflection from one of the ferry windows. For a moment, I saw its outline more clearly. It was almost straight along one side and curved along the other. The front tapered slightly. I could not see a tail. The man stopped smoking. "That's not a seal," he said. We both watched it for another minute. The ferry changed course slightly to pass around a rocky point. I felt the deck lean under my feet. The shape turned with us. It did not cut across the curve or lag behind. It kept the same angle from the ship and the same distance from the hull, as though it was attached to us by something invisible. The man took out his phone and tried to film it. On his screen, the water looked almost black. The shape did not show. He changed the brightness and tried again. Still nothing. He gave up and went inside without saying anything else. I stayed at the rail. The rain became heavier. Most passengers had already gone into the lounge, and the deck was empty, except for me and a crew member checking a door near the stern. The object continued beside us. Every so often, it seemed to move closer. I would look down and think it was only 5 meters from the ferry, then a wave would pass and it would be farther out again. I could not tell whether it was changing position or whether the water distorted the distance. I walked toward the rear deck to see if it continued past the stern. It stayed level with me. That was strange because I was moving backward along a vessel traveling forward. The object should have remained beside the same section of hull. Instead, it seemed to follow where I stood. I stopped. It stopped beside me. I walked forward again. The dark shape moved forward too. I told myself it was an effect caused by looking down at moving water. There was no way an object under the sea could track a person walking along the deck. I tested it again, 3 steps toward the bow. The shape slid forward, 2 steps back. It shifted back. A low vibration came through the railing. I felt it in my palms first, then through the soles of my boots. It was steady and faint, similar to the engine vibration, but slower. I took my hands off the rail. The vibration remained in my fingers. The crew member near the stern looked toward me. "You all right there?" I asked if there was any equipment running on the port side. He said only the normal engines and pumps. I pointed into the water. "There's something following us." He came over, more to humor me than because he was concerned. We stood side by side. For several seconds, the shape did not appear. Then it passed beneath a patch of lighter water. The crew member leaned forward. I asked what he thought it was. He said it might be a whale. I told him it had been there for at least 10 minutes and had not surfaced. He watched it turn with the ferry during another course correction. His expression changed slightly. "Stay away from the rail," he said. "Why?" He did not answer. He called someone on his radio and walked away. A minute later, another crew member came outside. She wore a navy jacket and carried binoculars, though binoculars were not much use for something almost directly below us. They spoke quietly near the door. The second crew member looked over the side, then toward the bridge. Neither of them came back to explain anything. I returned to the passenger lounge. The man in the yellow jacket sat near a window with his untouched coffee. I asked if the object was still there on his side. He shook his head. "I'm not looking again," he said. A few passengers glanced at us. I sat by the window. Through the glass, I could still see the shape beneath the surface. The angle made it harder to follow, but it remained beside the ferry. A young girl sitting across the aisle noticed me staring. She looked out and said, "There's another boat under us." Her mother told her there was not. The girl pressed her face close to the window. "It hasn't got any lights." Her mother pulled her back into her seat. The overhead speakers crackled. A normal announcement began about the cafe closing before arrival. Halfway through, the speaker went silent. A low tone replaced the voice. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Everyone in the lounge looked up. The announcement resumed in the middle of a sentence. My phone lost signal, which was normal in that area, but the clock also stopped changing. It showed 7:36 for long enough that I began counting. After about a minute, it jumped to 7:38. The ferry engines changed pitch. We slowed slightly as we approached a narrower stretch of water. Hills rose on both sides, dark with trees and wet rock. The object slowed with us. The surface became calmer near the shore, making the shape easier to see. It looked even larger now, at least 15 meters long and maybe half as wide. There were no clear features, but several pale marks ran along its upper side. They were evenly spaced and stayed in place as the water moved over them. I counted 6. They looked like dull rectangles beneath the surface. The man in the yellow jacket moved to the window beside me. "You see those?" I asked. He nodded. One of the pale marks went dark, then the next. They disappeared one at a time from the rear toward the front. When the last one faded, the object became almost impossible to see. A few seconds later, all 6 returned at once. The ferry turned sharply to starboard. The dark shape moved with us, but this time it came much closer to the hull. A deep knock passed through the floor. It was not loud, but several passengers felt it. Cups moved on tables. A baby started crying. The crew member in the navy jacket entered the lounge and told everyone to remain seated. Someone asked whether we had struck something. She said no. The floor vibrated again, 3 slow pulses, then 2 quicker ones. The girl across the aisle covered her ears. Her mother asked what was wrong. The girl said somebody was humming under the boat. I could not hear humming, but I felt pressure in my jaw and teeth. The windows fogged around the edges, not from the warm air inside. The condensation formed on the outside, leaving a clear oval area in the center of the glass. Through that clear patch, I saw the object directly below us. It had moved under the ferry. The dark shape crossed beneath the hull from port to starboard without appearing behind the stern or in front of the bow. The pale marks remained visible through the water, passing under us in a straight line. The cabin lights dimmed. Several phones lit up at the same time, though nobody had touched them. Mine displayed the camera screen. I had not opened the camera. The image showed the sea outside, but the angle was wrong. It looked upward toward the ferry from just below the surface. I could see the underside of the hull as a dark wall and the bright passenger windows above it. The picture moved smoothly along the length of the ship. For a second, I saw myself standing inside the lounge window. Then the camera closed and my lock screen returned. The man beside me had seen something similar on his phone. His face had gone pale. He asked if I had been filming. I said no. The ferry began moving faster again. The object returned to the port side. A crew announcement asked passengers to avoid the outside decks because of weather conditions. The rain had actually become lighter. I went outside anyway. The door alarm sounded when I opened it, but no one stopped me. The sky had brightened enough to show the line of the far shore. We were entering shallower water near Craignure. I could see patches of pale seabed through the waves and the tops of underwater rocks. The shape remained beside us. That was when I understood that it was not changing depth. The seabed rose toward the surface, but the object stayed at the same level it had held in deeper water. It should have collided with the bottom. Instead, it continued forward. As the water became shallower, more of the shape should have become visible. Nothing did. It looked as though the seabed passed through it. A large rock appeared directly in its path. The dark oval moved across the rock without going around or over it. For several seconds, the shape and the rock occupied the same space. The rock remained clearly visible beneath the dark patch, but its outline bent slightly, like I was seeing it through thick glass. Then the object cleared it. I stepped back from the rail. The crew member who had spoken to me earlier came through the door. He told me the deck was closed. I asked if he had seen it cross the rocks. He looked down, but did not answer. The shape began drifting away from the ferry. For the first time, it did not match our movement. It traveled toward the shore, keeping the same depth, even as the water became less than 2 meters deep. The upper surface of the object should have broken through. It did not. The sea above it stayed level. Small waves moved across the dark shape without changing. The object passed beneath a line of mooring buoys. Each buoy tilted toward it before it arrived, then leaned away after it passed. The ropes below them remained slack. A dog on the shore began barking, then another. Within seconds, dogs from several houses were barking toward the water. The object continued inland. I knew how that sounded, but it moved beyond the shoreline without stopping. The dark oval crossed under the shallow water, reached the wet stones, and remained visible as a faint distortion beneath them. Pebbles shifted along its path. A narrow line of darker ground moved up the beach. It traveled toward a row of low buildings near the ferry terminal. The pale rectangles appeared again, 6 dim marks beneath the stones. They turned slowly until they were vertical. The ground above them rose by a few centimeters, not breaking, just lifting in a long, smooth shape. The vibration returned through the deck. People on shore stopped walking and looked around. Nobody seemed to see the dark line moving toward them. It reached a grassy bank near the car park. The grass bent forward in a strip exactly the same width as the object. Then the shape stopped. A bright flash reflected off the clouds. There was no visible source and no sound. The whole harbor turned white for less than a second. When my vision cleared, the dark shape was gone. The grass on the bank stood upright again. The dogs stopped barking. The crew member told me to go inside. We docked a few minutes later. Passengers collected their bags and moved toward the stairs as though nothing unusual had happened. The man in the yellow jacket left without speaking to me. I went down to the vehicle deck and got into my van. My dashboard clock showed 8:11. My phone showed 8:24. The crossing should not have taken that long, but delays were common, so I checked the ferry timetable later. According to the public record, we had arrived at 8:12, exactly on schedule. The van in front of me drove off. As I reached the ramp, I noticed a wet mark on the concrete beside the tires. It was a long oval, darker than the surrounding deck. 6 narrow, dry rectangles sat inside it. I drove to the cottage and completed the plumbing work. I did not mention the object to the owner. That afternoon, I checked my phone gallery. There was one video recorded at 7:49. I had not filmed anything at that time. The video lasted 11 seconds and showed the ferry from underwater. The camera moved beside the port hull, keeping pace with the windows. The water was clear and completely silent. Near the end, the camera turned toward the seabed. A dark oval shadow moved below it, deeper down. For one frame, 6 pale rectangles appeared along the shadow. Then the image tilted upward. Through one of the ferry windows, I could see myself looking down at the water. Something tall and narrow stood behind me in the lounge. When I drove home 2 days later, I took a different ferry. Just before we reached Oban, a child near the window pointed toward the harbor wall. A dark shape moved beneath the shallow water beside the rocks. It kept pace with the ferry until I switched on my van's headlights, then it disappeared. The air went smooth about 20 minutes after I released from the tow plane. I had launched from a small gliding club near Sutton Bank in North Yorkshire, just after 3 on a warm Saturday afternoon. The forecast had promised decent thermals, but the conditions were rougher than expected. Broken clouds sat around 4,000 feet, and the wind pushed hard from the west. Every climb came with sharp bumps, sudden drops, and constant corrections. My name was Daniel Kerr. I had been flying gliders for 9 years and owned a half share in an older fiberglass single-seater, a standard Cirrus. It was not fast compared with newer gliders, but I knew how it handled. I knew the sounds it made, the way the wings flexed, and how much pressure should come through the controls in rough air. That afternoon, everything felt normal until I reached the edge of the moors. I was at about 3,600 feet, heading north along a dark stretch of heather. The variometer kept jumping between strong lift and heavy sink. I was considering turning back toward the airfield when the turbulence stopped. It did not fade gradually. 1 second, I was being knocked around hard enough to tighten my harness. The next, the glider became completely still. The wings leveled. The control stick felt light in my hand. The variometer showed steady lift at 4 knots. I looked at the instrument twice because lift that smooth usually came from wave conditions, and there was no forecast for mountain wave that day. The cloud and wind did not fit either. Thermals could be strong, but they were never that clean on an afternoon like that. I started circling. The lift stayed constant through the entire turn. Usually one side of a thermal gave stronger lift than the other. You adjusted the circle to center it. This was different. The needle held at exactly 4 knots, no matter which direction I faced. I widened the circle, still 4 knots. I tightened it, no change. The rough air remained visible around me. I could see small clouds forming and breaking over the ridge. Birds below were being pushed sideways in the wind. My glider sat inside something perfectly calm. I called the club frequency. Cirrus 7-1, unusual smooth lift north of the ridge, 3,800. No one answered. I tried again. Static came through the headset, followed by a faint clicking sound. 2 clicks, a pause, then 3. The radio had worked 10 minutes earlier when I spoke to another pilot. I checked the frequency and volume. The clicking repeated. I switched to the emergency frequency, though there was no real emergency yet. Nothing. I continued climbing. 4,000 feet. 4,200. The lift remained steady, and the sky ahead looked wrong. At first, I thought I was seeing a patch of thin cloud beside the right wing. It was faint and white, almost transparent. It formed in a curved line a few meters beyond the wingtip. The air was warm enough that condensation should not have formed at that height except inside cloud, and I was in clear air. The white line grew. It traced part of an oval shape beside the glider. I turned my head and looked directly at it. The condensation did not drift with the wind. It stayed fixed relative to my aircraft, just beyond the right wing. More of it appeared along the upper edge, like moisture collecting around a solid surface I could not see. The outline was much larger than the glider. From what I could judge, the oval shape was at least 20 meters long and maybe 8 meters high. Only sections of its edge showed at any one time. The rest remained invisible. I stopped circling and flew straight. The lift followed me. The variometer still showed 4 knots. The condensation shape stayed beside the wing. I banked gently left. The invisible oval matched the turn. It did not lag behind or cut across my path. The pale outline remained at the same distance, perhaps 6 meters from the wingtip. That was when I became frightened. I had spent enough time in the air to know how easy it was to misunderstand distance and movement. Reflections in a canopy could look like objects. Small clouds could seem closer than they were. The brain filled in gaps. I checked the canopy. The pale line remained visible when I moved my head. It passed behind a small scratch in the perspex, proving it was outside. I leveled the wings. The lift increased to 6 knots. My seat pressed gently against my back as the glider climbed faster. The altimeter passed 4,500 feet. The cloud base was only a few hundred feet above me. I pushed the nose down to leave the lift. The airspeed increased. The variometer stayed positive. I lowered the nose farther. The glider accelerated to 80 knots, but I kept climbing. That should not have happened. Even strong rising air would have given me some change in vertical speed as I flew out of it. Instead, the lift seemed attached to the aircraft. The condensation thickened along the oval. For a few seconds, I saw almost the entire outline. It stood slightly higher than the glider and leaned forward at an angle. The front was narrower while the rear curved outward. There were no wings, tail, or visible surface, only a white layer of moisture wrapping around something that displaced the air. Inside the outline, the sky looked slightly darker. I saw cloud through it, but the cloud appeared stretched as though viewed through uneven glass. The radio clicked again. This time, a voice came through under the static. It sounded like my own call sign, but the words were slowed down. Cirrus 7-1. I answered without thinking. Station calling 7-1, say again. The transmission stopped. The condensation nearest the cockpit moved. A narrow section of the oval pressed inward toward me, like a dent forming in the outline. It came closer to the canopy. The glider rolled 5 degrees right. I corrected left. The controls felt delayed. I moved the stick, but the wing responded a moment later than it should have. The rudder pedals felt soft under my feet. My compass began turning, even though the aircraft was almost straight. North became east, then south. The GPS still showed my correct heading. I looked toward the ground. The ridge beneath me seemed to slide sideways rather than backward. Roads and fields shifted at an angle that did not match my course. I wondered if I had become disoriented. I checked my airspeed, attitude, and turn indicator again. All looked normal, except the compass. The lift increased to 8 knots. The cloud base approached quickly. I did not want to enter cloud in a glider without proper instruments. I pulled the air brake lever. The air brakes opened. The aircraft shook as expected, but the climb barely slowed. The invisible oval remained beside me. Condensation spread over its lower edge and formed several pale patches along the side. They were evenly spaced, each about the size of the cockpit canopy. They looked like dull windows. Nothing was visible behind them. I opened the air brakes fully and pushed the nose down. The glider entered a steep descent attitude, but the altimeter continued climbing for another 5 seconds. Then it stopped. The needle rested at 4,900 feet. The cloud above looked close enough to touch. The world became silent. Wind noise disappeared. The glider normally hissed and whistled in flight, especially with the air brakes open. I heard none of it. The radio stopped hissing. The wings made no creaks. I could hear my breathing inside the cockpit. The pale oval stayed beside me. The condensation along its edge pulsed slowly. It brightened, faded, and returned. One of the dull patches changed shape. A dark mark appeared behind it. It was vertical and narrow. I watched it move from one side of the patch to the other. It might have been cloud distortion. It might have been a shadow inside the moisture. It did not have a clear head or limbs, but it stopped near the center and seemed to face the glider. I looked away. My watch showed 3:42. The panel clock showed 3:35. I had set both before takeoff. I tapped the watch. The second hand moved normally. The radio came back with a burst of static. A male voice said, "Daniel, turn away." I recognized the voice as Peter Mallory, one of our instructors. I pressed the transmit button. "Peter, where are you?" No answer. The voice repeated, "Daniel, turn away." Exactly the same tone, exactly the same timing. I looked around for another glider. The sky was empty except for the invisible shape and a line of cloud above the ridge. I banked hard left. The Cirrus responded properly this time. The oval stayed with me through the first part of the turn. Then its outline tilted. Condensation gathered over the upper surface, showing a curved shape extending above and behind the aircraft. It was larger than I had thought, wide enough that the right wing could have fitted inside its outline. The pale patches along its side turned vertical as it banked. The dark mark remained behind one of them. The glider shuddered. The lift vanished. It disappeared as suddenly as it had started. The variometer dropped from +8 knots to -6. My stomach lifted as the aircraft fell into heavy sink. The condensation shape broke apart. The white outline streamed backward and dissolved in the rough air. For 1 second, a dark oval remained beside the wing, visible without condensation. It had no clear edge and no lights. Then it was gone. The wind noise returned with a roar. The glider rolled sharply right. I corrected, closed the air brakes, and lowered the nose to maintain speed. The turbulence came back worse than before. I lost nearly 500 feet in less than a minute. The radio filled with voices. 2 other pilots were talking over each other, and someone from the airfield was calling my registration. 7-1, Sutton Base? Radio check, I answered. My voice shook more than I wanted it to. Sutton Base, 7-1 receiving. Peter came on. Daniel, confirm your position. I gave him the GPS location and altitude. There was a pause. You've been out of contact for 12 minutes. I told him I had radio interference. He asked whether I was all right. I said yes and told him I was returning. The ridge looked farther away than it should have been. According to the GPS, I was nearly 6 kilometers east of the position where I had entered the smooth lift. I had no memory of traveling that distance. I checked the time. The panel clock showed 3:48. My watch showed 3:55. The 7-minute difference remained. I headed back toward the airfield. The return flight took about 15 minutes. The air was rough the entire way. Twice, I felt a patch of smooth air touch the right wing, but it lasted only a second. I kept looking outside. Nothing followed me. As I approached the circuit, Peter asked me to perform a normal overhead join. I lowered the landing gear and checked the controls. Everything worked. I landed harder than usual, but stayed on the runway. Peter and another club member helped push the glider clear. He asked what had happened because my flight trace had looked strange. I told him I had found strong lift, lost radio contact, and become disoriented near cloud. He showed me the tracking screen inside the clubhouse. My path looked normal until I reached the ridge. Then the line stopped. There was an 11-minute gap. The trace resumed nearly 6 kilometers east, heading toward the airfield. The logger had recorded altitude and speed during the missing section, but no position. It showed a steady climb from 3,600 to 4,900 feet. Then it showed a vertical drop of almost 400 feet in less than 2 seconds. That should have damaged the aircraft or injured me. Neither happened. Peter asked whether I had turned off the GPS. I said no. He asked about the radio transmission. What transmission? The one telling me to turn away. Peter looked confused. He had not spoken to me during the loss of contact. He had been on the ground helping another pilot launch. The voice on the radio had not come from him. We inspected the glider. There was no damage to the wings or controls. The air brakes worked normally. The compass had returned to the correct heading. On the right wing, about half a meter from the tip, we found a damp line. It curved across the upper surface in a smooth arc. The rest of the glider was dry. Peter wiped the line with a cloth. The moisture smelled faintly metallic like wet coins. There was no stain beneath it. I drove home before sunset. My wife, Naomi, asked why I was early and why I looked ill. I told her the flight had been rough. I checked my watch against the kitchen clock. It was still 7 minutes fast. I reset it. That night, I downloaded the audio from the cockpit recorder. Most of the flight contained normal wind and radio noise. At 3:31, the sound became completely silent. The silence lasted 11 minutes. Near the middle of it, there was one faint sound, not a voice, more like something rubbing along the outside of the canopy. At the end, just before the wind returned, my own voice spoke very quietly. I did not remember saying anything. The recording said, "It was beside the wing." A second voice answered from much closer to the microphone. It repeated the same words, but more slowly. The following weekend, I returned to the club and flew with Peter in a 2-seat trainer. The weather was calm. We stayed near the airfield. Nothing unusual happened. After landing, I walked back to my car and noticed a narrow patch of condensation on the passenger side window. The afternoon was warm and every other window was dry. The damp line curved into part of a large oval. As I unlocked the door, the rest of the shape briefly formed across the glass. Something dark appeared in the reflection behind my shoulder. I turned. The car park was empty. When I looked back, the window was clear. The shadow crossed the snowfield about 10 minutes after we left the marked trail. There were 3 of us. Me, my brother Jamie, and a woman named Ruth Calder, who worked with him at a building supply company in Inverness. We were hiking near Miel Abuak Shaili in the Cairngorms, though we were not attempting the summit. The plan was to follow a lower route through the forest, cross an open section of moor, and loop back before dark. It was the middle of February. The temperature was below freezing, but the weather was unusually clear. There was no wind at ground level, and the sky was a hard blue from one horizon to the other. The snowfield was maybe half a kilometer wide. It sloped gently upward toward a ridge covered in short, dark pines. Most of the snow was untouched, apart from a few deer tracks and the shallow dents left by wind. Jamie was walking ahead. Ruth was behind him, and I was last. I saw the shadow move from right to left about 30 meters in front of us. At first, I thought a bird had flown over. It was a dark oval patch, wider than a car, moving smoothly across the snow. It had soft edges, but a solid center, like the shadow of something large passing low overhead. I looked up. The sky was empty. No bird, no plane, no cloud. The shadow continued across the slope and disappeared near the tree line. I asked if the others had seen it. Jamie said, "Seen what?" Ruth had noticed it. She pointed toward the trees and said it had looked like a helicopter shadow. There was no engine sound. We waited for one because sound could arrive late in the mountains. Nothing came. Jamie said it might have been a patch of loose snow blowing over the surface, but the air was still. I could see powder sitting on exposed rocks without moving. We carried on. The route was easy to follow at first because an old fence line ran toward the ridge. The wooden posts stood at regular intervals, some almost buried. We stayed close to them to avoid wandering too far into deeper snow. A few minutes later, the shadow returned. It came from behind us this time. I noticed the snow darkening around my boots. The patch moved beneath all 3 of us and continued ahead. There was no change in temperature, but the light seemed to drop for a second as if the sun had gone behind cloud. I looked up again. Clear sky. Jamie stopped. The shadow stopped too. It rested on the snow about 20 meters ahead, stretched into a long oval across the fence line. We stood still. The dark patch did not move. Jamie looked at me. "Is that what you meant?" I said yes. Ruth took out her phone and aimed it at the snow. The shadow faded slightly on her screen. In person, it remained obvious. She took a photograph. The image showed ordinary white snow. Jamie walked forward 3 steps. The shadow moved 3 steps farther away. He stopped. It stopped. He stepped sideways. The shadow shifted sideways with him, though not in exactly the same direction. It moved at an angle, keeping itself ahead of us. That was the point when we stopped treating it like something harmless. We checked the sky carefully. The sun was behind us and slightly to the right. If an object had cast the shadow, it should have been somewhere above and behind our position. There was nothing there. The horizon was clear enough that we could see a passenger jet far to the east, leaving a thin white line. It was nowhere near us and far too high to make a moving patch like that. Ruth said we should turn back. Jamie agreed. When we turned, the shadow moved around us. It did not cross the ground in a curve. It seemed to disappear from one side and reappear in front of our new direction. It was now between us and the forest we had come from. We started walking downhill. The shadow moved ahead at our pace. When Jamie walked faster, it sped up. When Ruth slowed to adjust one of her gaiters, it slowed, even though Jamie and I kept moving for several steps. That made no sense. It seemed to respond to the group, not to one person. We stopped again. The shadow settled on the snow. Its shape changed slightly while we watched. The oval became narrower at one end and wider at the other, almost like something turning sideways above us. I could not see any matching shape in the sky. My ears started to feel blocked. I swallowed and heard a faint click in my jaw. Jamie rubbed one ear at the same time. Ruth asked if we could hear a humming sound. I could not at first. Then I noticed it beneath everything else. It was very low, almost more of a pressure than a sound. It seemed to come through the ground. There was no machinery nearby. The closest road was several miles away. Jamie told us to stay close and keep moving. We walked back along our own tracks. The marks should have made the route easy, but after about 5 minutes, they began to look wrong. There were too many. 3 parallel sets showed where we had walked out, but a 4th line of footprints ran beside them. The extra prints were narrow and deep. They did not look like normal boot marks. Each one was a long depression with a rounded front and no visible tread. They appeared on Jamie's left side between him and the fence. I asked whether someone else had used the route earlier. Ruth pointed out that the extra prints crossed ours several times. They had not been there on the way up. Jamie crouched to look at one. The depression was about 30 centimeters long, but only 10 centimeters wide. The snow inside it had melted and refrozen into a smooth gray surface. There was no heel mark. The next print sat nearly 2 meters away. Whatever had made them had taken very long steps. We followed the line with our eyes. It continued ahead toward the forest. The moving shadow sat over it. Jamie stood quickly. We moved away from the fence and angled south, hoping to reach the main trail from another direction. The shadow adjusted its position and stayed ahead. The extra footprints did not turn with us. They continued straight toward the trees. For a few minutes, nothing else happened. Then the landscape went quiet. There had not been much sound before, but I had heard the scrape of our boots, the click of trekking poles, and occasional branches shifting near the tree line. Those sounds faded. I could still feel my feet breaking through crusted snow, but the noise seemed far away. Ruth said something to Jamie. Her mouth moved, but I heard only a weak murmur. I took off my hood, thinking it had blocked my ears. The silence remained. The shadow grew darker. It moved closer until its edge touched our tracks. The snow beneath it looked gray and flat. Small sparkles of ice disappeared as the patch crossed them. Jamie shouted, though his voice sounded muffled. He pointed upward. A faint distortion had appeared in the sky. It was almost directly above the shadow. There was still no visible object. Instead, a section of blue looked slightly different, like heat rising above a road. The shape was oval and much larger than the dark patch below. It moved when we moved. I watched the edge pass in front of a distant contrail. The white line bent where it crossed the distorted area, then straightened again beyond it. Ruth saw that too. She grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. We began walking faster. The terrain sloped down and the snow became deeper near a shallow gully. Our boots sank to mid-calf. Jamie broke trail while Ruth and I followed. The distortions stayed overhead. The shadow moved across the uneven snow without changing shape. It went over rocks and dips as if the ground were flat. At the gully, Jamie stopped so suddenly that Ruth nearly walked into him. The shadow had crossed to our left and stood on the slope beside us. For the first time, it was not ahead. It was pacing us. The distorted patch in the sky had also moved. I had to tilt my head far left to see the slight bending in the blue. Something clicked inside my rucksack. It sounded like the metal buckle on my water bottle. Then the same click came from Ruth's pack. Then Jamie's. 3 clicks in a row. A pause. 2 more. Jamie took his radio from his jacket. We carried cheap handheld radios in case we became separated in the forest. The screen was blank. He pressed the power button. A voice came through before the screen lit up. It sounded like Jamie saying, "Keep moving." His mouth had not moved. The recording repeated, slower. "Keep moving." Jamie switched the radio off. The voice continued for another second. We did keep moving. The gully led toward a group of large boulders that I remembered from the route map. Beyond them, the main path should have been less than a kilometer away. The shadow followed beside us. Every time one of us looked directly at it, it became fainter. When I watched from the corner of my eye, it darkened again. I tried not to look up. The pressure in my ears increased. I could hear my heartbeat. Ruth's nose started bleeding. It was not heavy, but a thin red line ran over her lip. She wiped it with her glove and said she felt dizzy. We stopped near the boulders. The shadow stopped too. The sky distortion held above it. Jamie took out his phone to check the map. The screen showed 2:36. My watch showed 2:28. Ruth's phone showed 2:47. We had all checked the time before leaving the car, and our clocks had matched. Jamie's map could not find our location. The blue position marker jumped from one side of the ridge to the other, sometimes several kilometers away. A thin layer of frost began forming on his phone screen. It spread from the top edge downward, even though the device was warm from his pocket. The frost formed an oval, clear space in the center. Inside that clear patch, the map showed a second marker. It sat directly beside ours. There was no label attached to it. Jamie locked the phone. The second marker remained visible for a moment after the screen went black. Ruth said she heard footsteps behind the boulders. I heard them a second later. The steps were slow and widely spaced. Snow compressed with a deep crunch, followed by several seconds of silence, then another crunch. Nothing appeared around the rocks. The shadow moved toward the boulders. The footsteps stopped. A narrow dark line rose across one stone, like a shadow climbing vertically. It reached the top and continued upward into empty air. For a few seconds, I could see the outline more clearly. It was not the shape of an aircraft. It looked like a large oval standing on its side, with the lower edge close to the snow and the upper part reaching several meters above us. The air inside the outline seemed darker and slightly blurred. Several pale marks appeared along one side. They were small and evenly spaced. Ruth whispered that they looked like windows. I told her not to say that. One of the pale marks darkened. Something moved behind it. I saw only a thin vertical shape crossing from one side to the other. The low humming became strong enough to vibrate my teeth. Jamie raised his trekking pole and threw it toward the shadow. The pole passed through the dark area and landed in the snow. The shadow folded inward around it, not physically. The edges pulled toward the pole, making the oval narrower. The pale marks turned toward us. The silence broke. A strong wind hit from above. Snow lifted around our legs and rose in a spinning column. It did not blow across the slope. It traveled upward into the distorted patch. We covered our faces. The shadow expanded over the boulders and crossed beneath us. For a second, I could not see the snow. Everything below my boots looked dark and deep, like open water at night. Ruth screamed. The ground returned. The lift from the wind vanished. Jamie's trekking pole was gone. The oval distortion moved ahead and stopped over the next slope. I grabbed Ruth's arm and we ran. Running through deep snow was difficult. We stumbled, pulled each other upright, and kept going toward where the path should have been. The shadow no longer matched our speed. It stayed behind. I looked back once. The dark oval rested near the boulders. The clear sky above it bent around a much larger shape. Its upper edge briefly caught the sunlight, not as a solid surface, but as a thin white curve. Then the whole thing began moving toward us. We reached the main trail less than 5 minutes later. 2 cross-country skiers were coming from the opposite direction. A man and a woman, both wearing bright red jackets. The moment they appeared, the pressure in my ears released. Normal sound returned. Wind moved through the trees. My boots scraped loudly against the packed trail. The shadow stopped at the edge of the open snowfield. It did not cross onto the trail. The skiers asked if we needed help. Jamie said Ruth had a nosebleed, and we had become disoriented. I turned toward the snowfield. The shadow was fading. The oval distortion rose slowly into the blue sky. I tracked it by watching a faint bending of the ridge line and a small section of contrail far above. Then it disappeared. The skiers saw nothing. They walked with us toward the forest shelter where we sat for about 20 minutes. Ruth's nose stopped bleeding and her dizziness eased after she drank water. Our phones all showed the same time again, 3:11. My watch showed 2:59. According to the tracking app on Jamie's phone, we had covered almost 7 kilometers in 12 minutes between the boulders and the main trail. The actual distance was less than 1 kilometer. The app also showed a straight section of movement running northwest across ground we had never crossed. At one point, the recorded altitude jumped nearly 300 meters and returned to normal in the same minute. We reached the car before 4 and drove back to Aviemore. None of us spoke much. At the hotel, Jamie reported the missing trekking pole to the outdoor center, mostly because it had been rented. He said he had dropped it somewhere near the boulders. A staff member found it 3 days later. It was standing upright in the middle of the snowfield, far from any marked route. The lower half was buried in hard snow. The upper aluminum section had turned dull gray and perfectly smooth. The wrist strap was gone, but it had not been cut. Jamie paid for the damage and kept the pole. He gave it to me a few weeks later because he did not want it in his flat. I stored it in my garage. By spring, the gray surface had returned to normal metal except for a narrow oval patch near the handle. One clear afternoon in May, I carried it outside to take another photograph. The sun was high and there were no clouds. As I placed the pole on the grass, a broad shadow moved over my garden. It stopped when I stopped. I went inside and locked the door. From the kitchen window, I watched the shadow remain beside the pole for nearly a minute. Then it continued across the lawn and passed through the fence without changing shape. The first signal turned green at 2:14 in the morning. I was working alone in Bracken Moor Signal Box, an old brick building on the edge of a freight yard in Lancashire. Most of the signaling had been automated years earlier, but the box stayed open because 3 active lines still crossed near the depot. My job was to watch the panel, confirm movements with control, and deal with faults when the system did something it was not supposed to do. The branch line was not active. It ran north from the yard toward a closed cement works and ended beside a quarry that had not used rail traffic since 2008. The points were clipped, the rails were rusty, and several sections were partly covered by weeds. The line still appeared on the panel because removing it would have meant replacing older equipment. There were 6 signals along that branch. All of them were supposed to remain red. The first one changed near the quarry end, nearly 4 miles away. A small lamp on the panel switched from red to green. At the same time, the track circuit behind it lit up, showing a train occupying the section. I stared at it for a few seconds, expecting it to clear. It did not. I called regional control. A man named Trevor answered. I had spoken to him earlier about a late engineering train. Control, Bracken Moor. I've got an occupation on the old quarry branch. There was a pause while he checked. That line's closed. I know. Which circuit? I gave him the number. He said his display showed the branch clear. While he was talking, the next signal changed. Green. The occupied section moved toward the yard. The first track circuit cleared behind it, exactly as it would after a train passed. I told Trevor. He asked if there was any maintenance work listed. I checked the overnight schedule again. Nothing on the branch, no inspection vehicle, no engineering crew, and no planned electrical test. The third signal went green. The movement was coming south. I looked through the control room window toward the yard. Rain had stopped, but everything outside was wet and black. Floodlights covered the active sidings. Beyond them, the branch disappeared behind a line of warehouses. I could not see any headlights. I listened for an engine. There was only the quiet hum of the panel equipment and water dripping from the gutter. Trevor told me to hold all movements near the junction. A loaded freight train was due in 20 minutes, but he said he would keep it outside the area until we understood the fault. I locked the branch points against the main line. The system showed them already locked. That should have prevented any movement from the branch, even if a train somehow existed there. The fourth signal turned green. The light on the panel did not flicker or hesitate. It changed cleanly, as if a route had been properly set. I checked the route controls. No route had been requested. I pressed the replacement button to force the signal back to red. Nothing happened. The green lamp stayed on. Outside, somewhere beyond the freight sheds, a metal gate banged once. The wind had dropped, so the sound carried clearly. I leaned toward the window. A row of security lights ran beside the branch. The first one, farthest away, went out, then the next. They did not fail together. They switched off in a steady sequence, moving toward the signal box. Trevor asked if I was still there. I told him about the lights. He said he was contacting the electrical control officer. The fifth signal changed. The branch was less than a mile from the yard now. I felt a pressure change in the room. My ears closed slightly, like they did in a fast lift. The old window frames gave a short rattle and settled. I looked at the barometer fixed beside the door. It was an old decorative one, not railway equipment, but the needle was moving. It dropped slowly. The control room clock showed 2:18. My phone showed 2:21. I assumed the wall clock was wrong. It lost time occasionally. The radio on the desk clicked. A burst of static came through, followed by a low tone. I picked up the handset. Bracken Moore. No voice answered. The tone became deeper. Under it, I heard something like wheels on rail, very faint and far away. It did not have the regular rhythm of a train moving over joints. It sounded smooth, almost like a continuous scraping sound. I called Trevor again. He said he could hear interference on my line, but no train noise. The fifth track section showed occupied. The fourth cleared behind it. Whatever the system was detecting kept moving at a steady speed. I checked the CCTV feeds. The camera near the branch junction showed wet rails, an empty signal, and the locked point blades. The signal itself appeared green on the camera, matching the panel. That should have been impossible. The signal had no active route and should not have displayed a proceed aspect. The image broke into horizontal lines. For 2 seconds, a pale patch crossed the far end of the track. It was low and wide, like fog moving against the wind. Then the feed returned to normal. I replayed the clip. The 2 seconds were missing. The recording jumped from 2:20:14 to 2:20:17. The sixth and final signal changed to green. It stood just beyond the junction, less than 200 meters from the signal box. I could see it through the side window. A clear green light shone above the black rails. Nothing was beneath it. No locomotive, no maintenance trolley, no headlights. The pressure in the room increased. The windows bowed inward slightly, then rattled hard in their frames. A stack of paperwork slid across the desk. The fluorescent lights dimmed but did not go out. Outside, the wet rails began to shine. At first, I thought the green signal was reflecting along them. Then I saw the brightness moving toward me in 2 narrow lines, following the track. It passed beneath the signal. The signal stayed green. The brightness continued along the rails without any visible source. The gravel between the sleepers darkened as if a shadow had crossed it. I stepped back from the window. The low tone from the radio became a vibration in the floor. I felt it through my boots and up my legs. A mug on the desk trembled. The T inside formed tight rings. The branch track circuit at the junction showed occupied. The signal beside the box went red. The others remained green behind it. That was the reverse of normal operation. A signal usually returned to red as soon as a train passed it. The final one had changed before anything visible reached it. The side window shook again. This time I heard a soft rushing sound outside. It came from the direction of the branch and moved toward the box. The air beyond the glass looked wrong. Rainwater on the outer window began running sideways instead of down. The droplets moved from right to left in narrow lines. Dust lifted from the ballast beside the track. It did not blow randomly. It rose in a long oval patch and hung about a meter above the ground. The patch moved along the rails. Whatever caused it was larger than a locomotive, but I could not see a solid shape. I saw only the effects around it. Water pulled from the sleepers. Loose paper near the fence flattened. A plastic bag lifted and wrapped itself around an invisible curved surface before dropping behind it. The thing approached the signal box. I moved to the rear wall. Trevor was still talking through the handset, asking me to confirm what was happening. I told him there was some kind of pressure wave moving down the line. He told me to leave the building. The exit door opened onto stairs beside the track. I did not want to step outside while something unseen was passing. The air pressure increased until my jaw ached. The room became very quiet. The panel relays normally made constant clicks as routes changed elsewhere in the yard. They stopped. The radio hiss stopped. Even the ventilation fan went silent. Through the front window, the oval patch in the dust reached the base of the signal box. The glass bent inward. I ducked behind the desk. A deep vibration passed through the building. It was not loud. It felt too low to hear properly. The bricks, floor, and metal equipment all seemed to move together. The window frames rattled so hard that I expected the glass to break. Something moved past outside. I saw no body, but a darker area across the window from left to right. The floodlights beyond it stretched into long, pale lines. The warehouse walls looked bent through the distortion. For several seconds, the signal box felt as if it were inside moving water. The air smelled metallic, like hot wiring and wet coins. My watch stopped. The second hand rested at 2:23. The panel clock still showed 2:20. The dark area moved beyond the building. The pressure released so quickly that my ears hurt. The ventilation fan restarted. The relays began clicking. A freight horn sounded far away on the main line. I stood slowly. The final branch signal was red. The fifth signal farther back changed from green to red a few seconds later, then the fourth. The signals returned to danger one by one, moving away from the yard toward the quarry side, as if something had passed me and continued backward along the route without turning around. The track circuits cleared in the same sequence. I picked up the radio. Trevor was calling my name. I answered. He said I had stopped responding for nearly 4 minutes. It had felt like less than one. I told him the branch now showed clear. His system still showed that it had been clear the entire time. I asked him to confirm my last transmission. He said the line had filled with a low noise after I mentioned the pressure wave. Then he heard what sounded like several people speaking at once. I had heard no voices. He told me to leave the box and wait in the car park for a response team. I put on my jacket and went downstairs. The air outside was cold and normal. The yard floodlights worked. The security lights beside the branch had come back on. The rails were wet except for 2 parallel strips running from the junction toward the disused line. Those strips were completely dry. I walked to the locked points. They remained clipped in the safe position. Nothing could have passed from the branch onto the main line without breaking the mechanism. The weeds between the rails were flattened. The flattened strip continued straight through the closed points and across the active track, then ended at the fence beside the signal box. There were no wheel marks, no broken plants. Everything had simply bent in the same direction. A security van arrived at 2:39. 2 railway response officers, Michelle Kerr and Anton Baines, got out. They checked the box, the signals, and the point equipment. I told them exactly what I had seen, though I kept the description simple. Signals changing, track circuits showing false occupation, pressure in the room. Anton suggested a signaling power surge. Michelle said a surge could not make the exterior signal lamps change in a proper sequence while the interlocking showed no route. They downloaded the event log. According to the log, nothing had happened. All 6 branch signals remained red between midnight and 3. The track circuits showed clear. The only recorded fault was a 4-minute communications loss at the signal box. We checked the CCTV. The junction camera showed normal empty track until 2:18. Then the image froze. It resumed at 2:25. The camera clock remained continuous, but 7 minutes of movement were missing. The control room camera inside the box showed me sitting at the desk during the entire period. That was not what I had done. On the recording, I did not stand, look through the window, or duck behind anything. I sat upright in the chair, facing the signal panel. My hands rested flat on the desk. For nearly 7 minutes, I did not move. Michelle watched the footage twice. I told her it was wrong. She asked whether I might have fallen asleep. I pointed out that my eyes were open. Anton enlarged the image. My face was turned slightly toward the branch window. In the dark glass behind me, a pale oval reflection moved slowly across the room. Nothing in the room should have made it. The reflection reached the center of the window and stopped behind my chair. A narrow, dark shape appeared inside it. Then the recording jumped forward. I was standing beside the desk with the radio in my hand. Anton stopped the video. Neither of them said anything for a while. At sunrise, an engineering team inspected the branch. They drove a small road rail vehicle as far as the locked point, then walked the remaining distance. The rails were heavily rusted beyond the junction. No vehicle had used them recently. About half a mile north, they found several lengths of rail polished bright on the top and inner edge. The polished section was perfectly straight and ended suddenly. There were no marks leading into it. Near the final signal, the grass between the sleepers had been pressed into a long oval. Nothing was burned or broken. By midday, the official explanation was a signaling fault caused by moisture in an old cable joint. The missing camera footage was blamed on a network interruption. The pressure wave was listed as possible freight movement on a nearby line. I was moved to day shifts for a week and sent for a medical check. My hearing was normal. My blood pressure was high, but settled after an hour. My watch remained stopped at 2:23 until I replaced the battery. 3 weeks later, I worked another night at Brackenmore. The old branch had been disconnected from the panel by then. The 6 signal lamps were physically isolated and the line was scheduled for removal. At 2:14, the first dead signal near the quarry appeared on the CCTV monitor. Its green lamp was glowing. A few seconds later, the next signal lit. Then the next. Nothing appeared on the panel because the circuits had been removed. I called control and told them to hold all traffic. The green lights advanced toward the yard. This time, I left the box before the final signal changed. I crossed the car park and stood behind the concrete maintenance building with the radio in my hand. The ground began to vibrate. The control room windows rattled above me. Something unseen moved along the branch and past the signal box. As it crossed the active lines, the rails gave off a dull gray shine. Then the signals returned to red, one by one. When the last green light went out near the quarry, my radio clicked. A voice came through. It sounded like mine. Very quietly, it said, "Route clear." The first apple I checked had turned almost all the way around on the branch. I noticed because the red side faced into the tree instead of toward the morning sun. The stem pointed northeast, toward the far end of the orchard. I assumed wind had twisted it, though the night had been calm. Then I checked the next apple. Its stem pointed the same way. So did the next one. I worked at an orchard outside Hereford, near a village called Mortiford. My name was Neil Brooks, and I had been there for 6 seasons. The place covered about 90 acres, mostly dessert apples, with a few older pear blocks near the river. By late September, we started before sunrise and worked until the heat made picking uncomfortable. That morning was cool and wet. Heavy rain had passed during the night, leaving mud between the rows. Mist sat low over the fields and drops of water hung from the leaves. I was checking row 18 for fruit damage before the picking team arrived. Every apple on the eastern side of the row had rotated so its stem pointed northeast, not roughly northeast, exactly the same direction. Apples did not hang like compass needles. Some grew upright, some sideways, some under branches. Their stems came out at different angles, but these had all twisted around their stems until the top of each fruit faced the same point beyond the orchard. I walked farther down the row. The pattern continued. Row 18 contained 64 trees. Each tree held dozens of apples. Every fruit I checked pointed the same way. Nothing had been picked. Nothing had fallen. The branches were not broken, and the apples showed no bruising where they had turned against twigs or leaves. It looked as if someone had taken the time to rotate each one carefully without damaging it. I called my supervisor, Beth Morgan. She thought I was joking until she came over. Beth had grown up on an apple farm and had managed the orchard for 12 years. She pulled one apple gently and checked the stem. "It's still firm," she said. I asked if a strong gust could do it. "Not every one." She walked around the tree, lifting branches and comparing fruit. The apples on the western side had turned 2. Some stems pointed through the center of the tree, forcing the fruit against branches. One small apple had pressed itself between 2 twigs without leaving a mark. Beth took out her phone and photographed it. The picture looked ordinary. Unless someone knew how the fruit had grown before, there was nothing clearly strange about a row of apples. She told me to check row 17. Those apples hung normally. Row 19 was normal too. Only row 18 had changed. By 6:30, 3 pickers had arrived. Marta Zielinska, her brother Powell, and a local lad named Owen Tate. Beth showed them the first tree and asked whether they had touched the row the previous afternoon. They had finished work 2 blocks away. Powell laughed at first. Then he followed the row for about 20 meters, checking apples at random. His smile disappeared. "They all look there," he said. He pointed northeast. That direction crossed the last part of the orchard, passed over a disused cattle field, and continued toward a wooded hill called Dinador Camp. The hill was not very high, but from our position it blocked the lower sky. Marta stood between the rows and looked toward it. "Did you hear something last night?" she asked. Beth asked what she meant. Marta lived in one of the caravans behind the packing shed. She said she had woken around 3 because of a clicking sound outside. She thought rain was hitting the roof, but the rhythm had been too regular. 3 clicks, a pause, then 2. Powell said he had heard it too. Owen looked uncomfortable. He lived in the village and had arrived by bicycle. He said he had heard clicking near the orchard gate at about 5:40 before anyone else got there. It seemed to come from above the hedge. He had looked for a bird or a loose electric fence wire and found nothing. Beth told us not to turn it into a story. She said there was probably a simple cause, such as wind moving through the road differently, because of the shelter belt. She called the orchard owner, Graham Bell, and asked him to come down. While we waited, I checked the ground. The soil between the trees was wet enough to record every boot and tire. I could see my own tracks and Beth's. Rabbit prints crossed near the irrigation pipe. A fox had walked along the edge of the row sometime during the night. There were no human footprints from before we arrived. No tire tracks, no ladder marks. The mud directly beneath the trees had an odd surface. It had not been pressed down, but the top layer looked smoother than the mud outside the row, almost as if a wide sheet had been laid over it and removed. I knelt and touched it. The mud was warm. The ground in row 17 felt cold enough to numb my fingertips. Inside row 18, the soil felt several degrees warmer. Beth checked it herself. She did not say anything, but she stopped suggesting wind. Graham arrived at 7 in his Land Rover. He was in his late 60s and usually treated any unusual problem as something that could be solved with a spanner, pesticide, or invoice. He checked 6 trees and said someone had played a prank. Beth showed him the mud. He said the rain had probably drained differently because the row sat slightly higher. It did not. Row 18 crossed the same slope as the others. Graham pulled an apple from a branch and cut it open with his pocket knife. The flesh looked normal. He tasted a piece. Then he spat it into the grass, Beth asked. He handed me another slice. The apple was sweet, but there was a faint metallic taste beneath it, like licking a coin after eating fruit. The other rows did not taste that way. Graham told us not to pick row 18 until he had spoken to an agronomist. The rest of the team went to another block. I stayed with Beth to mark the row and collect samples. At 7:18, the clicking started. It was faint enough that I thought someone was tapping a tool against a ladder. 3 clicks. A pause. 2. Beth stopped writing. The sound came again. It did not seem close or far away. It had no echo, even though we stood between rows of trees where sounds usually bounced around. We looked toward the packing sheds. No one there reacted. The clicking came a 3rd time from the northeast. Every apple in the row moved. They did not swing. Each one rotated a few millimeters on its stem. The leaves around them stayed still. I watched a large apple near my face turn until its stem pointed more precisely toward the hill. Beth stepped backward. The clicking stopped. A pressure built in my ears. It was mild but noticeable, like going down a steep road too quickly. The mist above the far field began to lift. It did not rise evenly. A narrow oval section pulled upward, while the rest stayed near the ground. The lifted mist formed a pale, curved edge against the darker trees beyond. Something seemed to be moving behind it. I could not see a solid object. The trees on the hill looked slightly stretched through that patch, as though viewed through uneven glass. Beth asked if I saw it. I said yes. The distortion remained above the field for several seconds. Then a tractor started near the sheds. The engine noise broke the quiet. The pale section of mist collapsed, and the trees looked normal again. Beth called Graham and told him to return. He said he was already on the road to meet the agronomist and could not come back immediately. He told us to leave the row alone. We did. At lunchtime, the mist had burned off and the sky was clear. The apples still pointed northeast. The agronomist arrived after 1. Her name was Dr. Louise Perry, and she worked for a company in Worcester. She examined the fruit, branches, soil, and leaves. She found no sign of disease, insects, frost damage, chemical exposure, or tampering. She said apples could rotate slightly as they gained weight, especially after rain, but she had never seen a whole row align. Graham asked whether electromagnetic equipment could do it. Louise looked at him as if he was trying to be funny. Apples aren't magnetic. She took samples of fruit and soil. Before leaving, she walked to the end of the row and stood facing northeast. "What's over there?" she asked. Graham said fields and the hill. Louise pointed to the apples. "They're not pointing at the hill." I asked what she meant. She used a compass app on her phone and drew an imaginary line through several stems. The direction passed above the hill around 12 degrees higher than the horizon. They pointed at the sky. That afternoon, cloud moved in from the west. By 4, the orchard had become dark enough that the automatic yard lights switched on. The workers finished early because more rain was expected. Beth asked me to help set up 2 wildlife cameras facing row 18. We fixed one to a tree at each end, checked the batteries, and made sure their views overlapped. I left at 5:30. The clicking followed me to the car park. 3 soft taps came from somewhere above the packing shed. Then 2 more. I looked up. Low gray cloud covered the whole sky. For a moment, a small, pale patch appeared directly over the northeast field. It was shaped like a narrow oval and stayed brighter than the cloud around it. Then it faded. I drove home to Ledbury. At 10:46, Beth called. She said the wildlife cameras had both stopped transmitting. The first went offline at 9:31. The second stopped 9 seconds later. She was at home and did not want to drive back alone. Graham had already gone to bed and was not answering. I told her I would meet her there. My wife thought we were being ridiculous, but she could see I was worried. I said I would check the cameras and come straight back. The rain had started again by the time I reached the orchard. Beth waited in her car near the gate. We drove down together in Graham's Land Rover because the mud had become too deep for my hatchback. The headlights swept over row 18. Every tree looked normal at first. Then Beth slowed. The apples were no longer pointing northeast. Their stems pointed upward. Every apple in the row had rotated so the top faced directly toward the sky. Some hung beneath branches with their fruit pressed sideways. Others had twisted their stems nearly around themselves. None had fallen. We stayed inside the vehicle. The rain tapped against the roof. Then the tapping changed. 3 clicks. A pause. 2. It came from above us, louder than before. The Land Rover's dashboard lights dimmed. The engine continued running, but its sound became distant. The rain on the roof went silent, even though water still moved across the windscreen. Beth tried the radio. Only a low, humming sound came through. The apples began to move again. One after another, starting at the far end of the row, they tilted slightly toward us. It was not the branches bending. Each fruit rotated on its own stem. The movement traveled down the row like a wave. The wildlife camera nearest us clicked. Its infrared lamp came on, though it should have remained invisible. A dull red glow lit the trunk. Something stood between the trees beyond it. I saw only a pale vertical section against the dark leaves. It looked narrow and very tall, with no clear head or arms. The camera clicked again. The shape was gone. A pressure wave struck the Land Rover. It was not an impact. The vehicle gave a deep shudder, and my ears blocked. Water lifted from the bonnet in a thin sheet. Above row 18, the rain stopped falling. Drops hung in the air, outlining a large oval space over the trees. It was wider than the entire row. The rain struck something invisible and ran around its curved lower edge. For a few seconds, we could see the outline clearly, not as a surface, but as an absence where the water could not pass. The apples all pointed toward its center. Beth whispered that we needed to leave. I put the Land Rover in reverse. The gear lever resisted, then moved. As we backed away, the invisible oval kept its position over the row. A line of small pale marks appeared inside it, high above the trees. They were weak and evenly spaced. One mark darkened. A thin shape moved behind it. The humming became stronger. The vehicle's clock showed 11:08. My phone showed 10:53. Beth's phone screen was completely white. I reversed faster. The oval tilted. Rainwater slid along its edge, showing a narrow end turning toward us. The orchard trees leaned without wind. The mud between the rows smoothed itself in a straight strip from row 18 to the gate. Something moved along that strip. I could not see it directly. I saw only puddles flattening and grass bending as it approached. The Land Rover stalled. Beth turned the key. Nothing happened. The movement stopped about 10 meters ahead. A faint clicking came from the bonnet. 3. A pause. 2. Then the headlights went out. For several seconds, we sat in complete darkness. The passenger window fogged from the outside. A clear patch formed in the condensation at about head height. Something pale passed across it. Not a face, just a narrow shape close to the glass. Beth held my arm so tightly that her nails hurt through my jacket. A bright flash filled the orchard. There was no sound. The trees, rain, and rose became white outlines, then vanished into darkness again. The Land Rover engine restarted by itself. The headlights came on. Rain fell normally across row 18. The oval above the trees was gone. The apples hung in random positions, the way apples should. We drove straight to the gate. My phone corrected itself to 11:11. I could not account for the missing 18 minutes. We both went home. The next morning, Graham, Louise, and 2 police officers inspected the orchard. Beth had called the police after speaking to Graham because neither of us wanted to return alone. There were no tracks in the mud except the Land Rover's tires. The wildlife cameras were still attached. Both had recorded until 9:31, then resumed at 11:09. The missing period showed as one continuous file with no image data. The final frame before the gap showed row 18 under rain. Every apple pointed upward. At the top edge of the frame, a pale curved line crossed the sky. The first frame after the gap showed the apples hanging normally. One thing had changed. All the stems pointed northeast again. Louise's lab results arrived several days later. The fruit and soil were chemically normal. The metallic taste had disappeared. The affected row was picked separately and stored for observation. Most of the apples spoiled within a week, much faster than the other fruit. When workers emptied the storage crate, they found the apples arranged in a ring. Nobody admitted moving them. Their stems all pointed toward the empty center. The following spring, row 18 flowered before any other trees in the orchard. The blossoms faced northeast, even on the western sides of the branches. One morning, I stood at the end of the row while Beth checked the new growth. The sky was clear. A clicking sound came from high above the hill. 3 clicks, a pause, 2. Every blossom turned slightly toward the same empty patch of blue. The first transmission came through when we were about an hour and a half underground. There were 4 of us in the group: me, Callum Reed, Nia Foster, and a man named Stephen Whale who had joined our caving club earlier that year. We were in a limestone system in the Yorkshire Dales, using an entrance on private farmland that the club had permission to access. It was a cold Saturday in March. Above ground, rain had been falling since morning, but the forecast said it would stay light. The cave itself was dry in the upper sections, and we had checked the water levels before entering. Callum went first because he knew the road best. Nia followed him, then me, then Stephen. That order mattered later. We each carried a short-range radio clipped high on our chest straps. They were not reliable through thick rock, but they helped when someone disappeared around a bend or dropped behind in a narrow section. The route began with a steep crawl, then opened into a passage tall enough to stand in. After that came 2 short climbs, a low bedding plane, and a larger chamber the club called the workshop because of all the flat blocks scattered across the floor. We stopped there to drink water. That was when my radio hissed. I thought someone had pressed their transmit button by mistake. The sound lasted about 3 seconds, then a voice came through. "Callum?" The word was faint and broken, but clear enough that all of us looked toward him. Callum touched his radio. "Who called me?" None of us had. Stephen said it might have been another group using the same channel. We had not seen anyone at the entrance, but there were other access points into the system. Callum pressed the button. "Unknown station, this is Calder Calving Club. Identify yourself." Only static came back. Then the voice said, "Nia." Nia looked at me. The way it said her name did not sound like a question or a call for attention. It was flat and slow, each sound separated slightly. "Nia." My radio clicked. Then it said my name, Tom. Stephen stepped closer to us. A few seconds passed. The voice said, "Stephen." It had repeated our names in the order we had entered the cave. Nobody joked after that. Callum changed the radio channel. We all changed with him. The new channel was quiet. He said someone was probably watching from the entrance and had heard us introduce ourselves. That did not explain why the signal reached us through so much rock, but it was better than saying we had no explanation. We packed up and continued. The next part of the route sloped downward through a passage with sharp ridges on the floor. Water dripped from the roof, making small, hollow sounds in the dark. Our helmet lamps were the only light. I kept checking behind me. Stephen was always there, a few meters back. Beyond him, the passage narrowed into blackness. About 15 minutes later, Nia's radio crackled. We had not changed back to the original channel. The same voice said, "Callum." This time it was louder. The word broke into static halfway through, then returned. "Call? Callum stopped. The voice continued. "Nia." Then my name. Then Stephen's. Same order. Callum took his radio off and checked the screen. The channel number had not changed. All 4 radios showed the same setting. He asked Stephen whether he had brought another transmitter. Stephen said no and emptied the top pocket of his pack to prove it. Nia said we should turn around. Callum looked at the time and the survey map. We were not yet halfway through the planned route. Turning back would have been simple at that point. He agreed. We reversed the order, which put Stephen first, then me, then Nia, with Callum at the rear. We had gone maybe 50 meters when the voice returned. "Callum." We stopped. "Nia." I felt my mouth go dry. "Tom." Then, after a longer pause, "Stephen." It still used the original entry order, not the order we were now walking. Stephen turned toward us. "That isn't someone watching us." Nobody answered him. We continued back toward the workshop. The radios began making short bursts of noise every few minutes. Sometimes it was only static. Sometimes there was a low sound underneath, like distant machinery or wind moving through a narrow gap. There should not have been any machinery near us. We were beneath open farmland and a section of moor. At one point, the noise changed into a series of clicks, 3 quick clicks, a pause, 2 slower ones. Nia turned her radio off. The screen went dark. The clicks continued through the speaker. She removed the battery. The sound stopped. We all did the same. Callum told us to leave the radios off until we reached the surface. Without the background hiss, the cave seemed much quieter. We could hear breathing, boots scraping stone, and water dripping in several directions. Then another sound appeared behind us, a soft crunch. It came from the passage we had just left. We waited. Nothing followed. Stephen said it was probably loose rock settling after we passed. The crunch came again, then again. The gaps between each sound were too regular. They resembled slow footsteps, though no person could have walked normally through that low section. Callum told us to keep moving. The workshop should have been less than 10 minutes away. We walked for nearly 20 and did not reach it. The passage looked familiar, but the distances felt wrong. A split in the wall that I remembered passing once appeared 3 times. A white mineral streak shaped like a hook kept showing up on our left. Callum stopped at the 3rd one and put his hand on it. "We're circling," Nia said. We had not taken any turns. She was right. The passage had no branches wide enough for us to enter by mistake. Callum checked the compass on his watch. The needle rotated slowly without settling. My own small compass did the same. Stephen took a piece of orange tape from his pack and tied it around a rock beside the mineral streak. We continued. 5 minutes later, the orange tape appeared ahead of us. It was tied around a different rock on the opposite side of the passage. Stephen swore and pulled it free. The knot was the same one he had tied. Callum studied the walls. He said we must have turned without noticing, though none of us believed that. The roof lowered. We crawled through a narrow section one at a time. When I came out, Nia was standing ahead of me with her lamp pointed at the floor. There were footprints in the mud. Not ours. They were long, narrow impressions with rounded ends and no tread. Each print was spaced almost 1.5 meters from the next. The mud around them was soft, but there were no marks entering from the sides. The line of prints came from the direction we were heading and stopped in front of Nia. Callum crouched beside one. He touched the edge with a gloved finger. The mud inside the print was warm. The cave air was cold enough that our breath showed faintly in the lamplight. The footprint gave off a weak metallic smell. Stephen asked whether an animal could have made it. Callum said no animal he knew. We went back the way we had come. though by then I was not sure which direction that was. A radio switched on inside my pack. I heard the startup tone through the fabric. I had removed the battery and placed it in a separate pocket. The voice came through. Callum. We all froze. Nia. The speaker crackled. Tom. The final name did not come. We waited. Static filled the passage. Then the voice said Stephen, but it came from farther away. Not from my radio. It echoed from somewhere ahead of us. Stephen's lamp moved sharply across the walls. Who's there? The cave answered with his own voice. Who's there? The words came back too clearly to be a normal echo. The tone was exact, but slower. Then another voice repeated it from behind us. We stood between the two sounds. Callum told everyone to switch off their lamps for 5 seconds. None of us wanted to, but he said we needed to check whether another person's light was visible. We turned them off. The darkness was complete. I held my breath. A pale glow appeared above us. It was not strong enough to illuminate the passage. It showed only a curved patch across the roof, about the size of a car bonnet. The light seemed to come through the rock rather than from below it. Several darker marks moved inside the glow. They were narrow and vertical. Then my radio said Tom directly beside my ear. I switched my lamp on. The glow vanished. My radio remained inside the pack with no battery. I took it out and dropped it on the floor. The screen was black. The speaker made 3 clicks. A pause. 2. Nia began breathing too quickly. Callum told her to slow down and focus on him. Stephen kept looking toward the roof. He said something was moving over us. I heard it a moment later. A low scraping vibration traveled through the stone above the passage. Dust fell in thin streams. The sound did not resemble rocks shifting. It was too smooth and too continuous, like a heavy object sliding across the other side of the ceiling. We were at least 60 meters underground. The vibration moved from behind us toward the direction of the footprints. As it passed overhead, pressure built in my ears. My teeth ached. The helmet lamps dimmed together. The scrape stopped. The radios all activated, even the ones without batteries. 4 voices spoke at once. Each voice sounded like one of us. Callum's radio said, Callum. Nia's said, Nia. Mine said, Tom. Stephen said, Stephen. Then the voices switched. My radio spoke in Nia's voice. Stephen's used mine. Callum's used Stephen's. The names repeated faster, overlapping until they became hard to separate. Callum kicked the radios into a shallow crack between rocks. The voices continued from inside it. The vibration started again, stronger this time. The floor trembled beneath my knees. A line opened in the mud between us. It was not a crack. The wet surface simply pulled apart in a narrow straight strip, exposing pale stone below. The strip moved along the passage towards Stephen. He stepped aside. It passed where he had been standing and continued into the dark. The pressure wave followed it, our clothing pressed against our bodies, as if a strong wind had blown through, but the cave air did not move. The pale glow returned overhead. For a few seconds, the shape of it became clearer. It formed a long oval across the roof. The rock inside the oval looked thinner, almost transparent. I could see a dull gray space beyond it, with several small lights in a row. Something dark crossed in front of those lights. Nia shouted. The vibration stopped. Every radio fell silent. The glow disappeared. The passage returned to normal darkness under our lamps. The muddy line closed slowly, water seeping back across the pale stone. Callum checked his watch. It showed 2:08 p.m. Mine showed 49. We had entered the cave shortly after noon. We had been underground for less than 2 hours by my memory. Stephen's watch showed 2:19. Nia's digital watch displayed only zeros. We heard running water ahead. Callum moved toward it, saying the sound might help us locate the mainstream passage. The footprints had vanished. We followed the water noise for about 5 minutes and emerged into the workshop. None of us understood how. We had been traveling away from it, according to the route we remembered. Our bags still sat near the flat rocks where we had first stopped. I had thought we had packed everything, but my water bottle remained beside them. The clock on Callum's spare GPS unit showed 2:31. Its track log contained a blank section lasting 27 minutes. Before the gap, it placed us in the lower passage. Afterward, it placed us in the workshop. There was no route between those points on the survey. We left immediately. The climb to the entrance took just under an hour. Nobody heard the voice again, but the rock around us vibrated twice. Each time, dust fell from the roof, and our compass needles turned toward the same wall. When we reached the entrance shaft, daylight showed above us. Callum climbed out first, then Mia, then me. Stephen came last. The order was the same as when we had entered. The rain had stopped. A farmer named Hugh Lister stood beside our vehicles. He owned the field around the entrance. He asked if we had been underground during the tremor. We said we had felt something. He told us there had been no recorded earthquake, but at around 2, the ground above the cave had produced a low hum. His sheep had moved to the far side of the field and stood facing the same patch of grass. He also said the metal hatch over the cave entrance had lifted several centimeters by itself. We checked our equipment beside the cars. All 4 radios worked normally after we replaced the batteries. Their logs showed no transmissions received during the time underground. My radio had 1 saved audio file. It was 9 seconds long. The first part contained static. Then a voice repeated our names in order: Callum, Naya, Tom, Stephen. After Stephen's name, there was a short pause. A 5th name followed. It sounded like Ellis. None of us knew anyone called Ellis. Stephen stopped caving after that trip. Naya returned once, but she would not enter the same system. Wherzal, Callum, and I went back 6 months later with a larger group to check the route. We found the workshop and the lower passages exactly where they appeared on the survey. There was no repeated mineral streak, no line of footprints, and no section where the walls could have led us in a circle. Near the place where our GPS track had ended, we found an old metal helmet lamp wedged high in a crack. It was covered in mud and rust. The battery compartment was empty. Someone had scratched a name into the side: Ellis. As Callum held it under his light, our radios clicked together. 3 quick clicks, a pause, 2 slow ones. The rock above us gave a deep, steady vibration. We left the lamp where it was and made it back to the entrance before dark. I first noticed the farmhouse about 15 minutes after the train left Carlisle. I was traveling south to Preston on a wet November evening. It had gone dark early, and rain kept streaking across the window in thin lines. The carriage was warm and mostly quiet. There were maybe 12 people in it, spread out with bags on the seats beside them. My name was Lewis Barrett. I worked as a service engineer for a company that repaired commercial kitchen equipment, and I had spent the day at a hotel outside Carlisle. My van was in for repairs, so I had taken the train. I sat on the left side, facing forward, with my coat folded under my head. I was tired but not asleep. I had a podcast playing through one earbud and was watching the fields whenever the train passed through gaps in the trees. The farmhouse appeared beyond a low stone wall. It was a large square building, probably Victorian, standing alone in the middle of a field. The roof sagged slightly in the center, and one chimney leaned to the side. Every window was lit. The light was a flat yellow-white, brighter than normal house lights. I could see it clearly through the rain. What caught my attention was that the place looked abandoned. Several windows had no glass. One upstairs opening had boards across it, but light still showed around the edges. Ivy covered one wall. The track leading to the house was overgrown. I watched it for a second, expecting it to slide behind us, like everything else. It did not. The stone wall moved past. Fence posts moved past. A line of trees crossed the window. The farmhouse stayed in the same place. I took out my other earbud and sat upright. The train was moving at normal speed. I could hear the steady rush beneath the floor and see rain blowing sideways across the glass. Fields and hedges passed between me and the house, but each time the view opened, the building was still there at the same angle. It did not get closer. It did not fall behind. It remained about half a mile away, slightly ahead of my seat. I thought the train might be curving around it. If the track made a long bend, a distant object could stay visible longer than expected. I looked forward through the carriage. The train seemed to be running straight. A cluster of trees blocked the view for several seconds. When they cleared, the farmhouse had not moved. The light in the windows was stronger now. I could make out 4 downstairs windows and 3 upstairs. The front door stood open and the hallway beyond it looked bright. A man across the aisle glanced at me because I had leaned close to the glass. I asked if he could see the house. He looked out for a moment. "What house?" "The one with all the lights." He followed where I pointed. "There's nothing there." I looked back. The farmhouse remained in the field. A signal box flashed past close to the track. Its reflection filled the window for a second. When it cleared, the building was still fixed in the same spot. I told the man it was a large place with a leaning chimney. He shifted into the seat beside me and looked out again. After a few seconds, he said, "Oh, that one." His voice had changed. I asked if it looked strange to him. He did not answer immediately. The farmhouse windows began turning off. Not all together. The lower left window went dark first, then the one above it, then the next downstairs window. The darkness moved across the building in a slow sequence. The man beside me leaned closer. "Is the train slowing down?" he asked. It was not. The movement of the near ground looked the same. The fourth window went dark. Only two upstairs windows and the open doorway remained lit. A shape crossed one of the upstairs windows. It was narrow and human-sized. It moved from left to right, blocking the light for about 2 seconds. I asked the man if he had seen it. He stood up without answering and returned to his original seat. He put headphones on and looked down at his phone. I kept watching. The last upstairs window went dark. Only the open front door remained bright. The rain on the glass stopped moving. Drops still covered the window, but they seemed frozen in place. Outside, the landscape continued sliding past behind them. My phone lost signal. The podcast timer stopped at 18:42. A low pressure filled my ears. The farmhouse doorway grew brighter. Something stood in it. At first, I thought it was a person. The shape had a head and shoulders, but it was too tall for the doorway. Its upper part reached the frame, while the lower part faded into the light. It did not step outside. It stayed in the doorway, facing the train. The field between us moved normally. Sheep passed in the foreground, their white bodies flashing between hedges. The farmhouse remained fixed. I looked around the carriage. No one else seemed concerned. A young woman 2 rows ahead typed on a laptop. An older couple shared a packet of crisps. The ticket inspector stood near the far doors reading something on a small screen. I got up and walked toward him. As I moved through the carriage, I kept checking the opposite windows. The farmhouse seemed to follow my position. It stayed visible through each window I passed, always at the same angle. I asked the inspector whether the train had slowed. He looked at me. "No." I asked where we were. "Just south of Penrith." I pointed out the window. "Do you know that farmhouse?" He looked. His face remained blank for a moment. Then he said, "There isn't a farmhouse there." It sounded rehearsed. I asked him to look again. He did, but only briefly. All I can see is open land. The building stood clearly behind him in the glass reflection. I could see the lit doorway and the tall figure inside it. The inspector's reflection faced me. The figure in the farmhouse moved. It raised one arm. The real inspector did not react. I turned back to the window. The shape's arm remained lifted. It seemed to point along the track ahead of us. Then the train entered a short cutting. High earth banks rose on both sides, blocking the view. The pressure in my ears increased. The carriage lights dimmed. A soft clicking came through the speaker above the doors. 3 clicks. A pause. 2 more. The train came out of the cutting. The farmhouse was still there. It should not have been. We had traveled several miles since I first saw it. The building now stood closer to the tracks, maybe 200 meters away. There was no longer a field between us, only a narrow strip of wet grass and a broken fence. The front door light spilled onto the ground. The tall figure was gone. Several people in the carriage turned toward the windows at the same time. The young woman stopped typing. The older couple lowered their crisps. Nobody spoke. They all stared at the farmhouse. I looked at the man who had sat beside me earlier. His phone was still in his hand, but the screen had gone black. He whispered, "It's closer." That was the first time anyone else admitted seeing it. The train continued at full speed. The building stayed level with us. I could see details now. The brickwork was dark with damp. Sections of guttering hung loose. The upstairs windows were empty openings except for one on the far side, which still held glass. A pale oval reflection appeared in that glass. It did not match the shape of the moon or any light inside the house. It looked like a dull patch floating behind the window. The front doorway darkened. A second figure appeared in one of the downstairs rooms. This one was shorter. It stood sideways and moved its head toward the train. The man behind me said, "Don't wave." I had not planned to. A child farther down the carriage pressed a hand to the window. The smaller figure inside the house lifted its hand. The child's mother pulled him back. The carriage lights went out. Emergency strips near the floor remained on, giving everything a faint green color. Outside, the farmhouse glowed more brightly. All 7 windows had lit again. Shapes stood behind several of them. I counted 5. None moved properly. They seemed to change position between moments, like sections of a damaged video. One stood at an upstairs window. Then it was at the window beside it without crossing the room. Another appeared behind the open door. The low clicking returned through the speakers. 3. A pause. 2. The train windows began to fog from the outside. Condensation spread over the glass, leaving a clear oval patch in front of my face. Through it, I could still see the farmhouse. The rest of the landscape became hidden. The building no longer seemed outside at normal distance. It looked flat and close, as if the window opened directly onto the field. The man across the aisle asked what time it was. My phone showed 7:19. The carriage display above the door showed 7:07. My wristwatch showed 6:58. We had left Carlisle at 6:41. The journey to that point should not have taken so long. The ticket inspector pressed the call button near the doors. Nothing happened. He tried his radio. Static filled the carriage speakers. A voice came through. It sounded like someone speaking from a long distance. I could only make out one word. Lewis. My name. I did not answer. The voice repeated it. This time, the figures in the farmhouse turned toward the train. All of them moved together. My phone vibrated. The screen displayed an incoming call from my own number. I declined it. The phone rang again. I switched it off. The screen went black, but the vibration continued in my hand. The train entered another cutting. The farmhouse disappeared behind the bank. The low pressure became painful. I held my nose and tried to clear my ears, but it did not help. A deep vibration passed through the carriage. The windows shook in their frames. Luggage racks rattled. The floor felt as though something heavy moved beneath it from the front of the train toward the rear. As the vibration reached our carriage, every emergency light went out. For 2 or 3 seconds, there was total darkness. Something tapped on the window beside me. Not from inside. 3 taps. A pause. 2. The train came out of the cutting. The lights returned. The farmhouse stood directly beside the track. It was close enough that I could see water running down the bricks. There was no space for it to be there. The rail line ran on a raised embankment, and the house seemed to stand level with the carriage windows. The front wall passed without moving backward. The train and building traveled side by side. Every window was empty now. The bright light remained, but no rooms were visible behind it. Each opening contained the same flat, pale glow. A dark shape appeared in the upstairs glass. It was my reflection. I saw myself standing in the carriage, one hand holding my phone. But the reflection did not copy me. It turned its head toward the interior of the house. Something stood behind it. A tall, narrow figure leaned close to my reflected shoulder. I stepped away from the train window. The reflection remained beside the house window. The figure behind it raised one arm and placed a hand against the glass. The hand looked wrong. The fingers were too long and spread evenly, with little difference between them. The glass bowed outward. I felt pressure against the carriage window beside me. A print formed in the condensation, 5 long marks and a narrow palm. The child began crying. His mother covered his eyes. The man across the aisle stood and moved toward the center of the carriage. The inspector shouted for everyone to stay away from the windows. The farmhouse lights switched off at once. Darkness filled every opening. The train gave a hard sideways jolt. People grabbed seats and rails. The vibration passed beneath us again, stronger than before. The farmhouse began to fall behind. Slowly at first, then faster. For the first time since I noticed it, the building moved normally across the window. It receded into the wet field, became smaller, and vanished behind a line of trees. The pressure released. The carriage lights brightened. My phone switched itself back on. The clock jumped from 7:19 to 7:34. The display above the door showed 7:12, then flickered and changed to 7:34. No announcement explained the delay. The train continued south. People sat down again without speaking. The inspector walked through the carriage, asking if anyone was injured. When I tried to ask about the farmhouse, he told me there had been a temporary electrical fault. The man across the aisle would not look at me. The child's mother moved to another carriage. A few minutes later, the train slowed for Lancaster. I checked the route on my phone. We had traveled far beyond the area where I first saw the house. The journey record showed no stop or delay. According to the rail app, the train was running 3 minutes early. I got off at Preston and took a taxi home. My partner, Erin, asked why I had arrived almost 40 minutes later than expected. I told her the train had lost power. The following morning, I searched satellite maps along the route. I found several farms, but nothing matching the house. I also checked old property listings and local history pages. One abandoned farmhouse had stood near the line north of Lancaster, but it had been demolished in 1996 after a fire. The photographs showed a square brick building with a leaning chimney. The window layout matched what I had seen. 3 days later, I contacted the railway company and requested information about the delay. They replied that the service had run normally and arrived in Preston on schedule. I asked whether there had been any electrical fault near Penrith or Lancaster. They said no fault had been reported. A week after the journey, I received an email from the man who had sat across from me. I had given him my work card before leaving the train because neither of us knew what else to do. His name was Adrian Cole. He attached one photograph. He had taken it through the window during the cutting when the farmhouse was hidden from view. The picture showed only the dark glass and the reflection of the carriage. In the reflected seats, every passenger faced the window. Behind us, in the aisle, stood 5 tall figures. Their bodies were blurred, but their heads were clear enough to see that they were turned toward the glass. At the far end of the reflection, beyond the carriage doors, a brightly lit farmhouse window filled the next compartment. I did not reply. 2 months later, I traveled the same route in daylight. The sky was clear, and the carriage was crowded. I watched the fields from Carlisle to Preston. Nothing stayed fixed. There were no lights and no abandoned house. Near Lancaster, the train passed an empty patch of land bordered by a broken stone wall. For a second, my reflection in the window remained still while the rest of the carriage moved around it. Behind my reflected shoulder, a pale rectangular light appeared. Then the train passed beneath a bridge and the glass went dark. I noticed the second reflection at 2:06 in the morning while I was standing outside the compressor room. I worked as an electrical technician on an offshore gas platform in the southern North Sea. We were about 80 miles from the coast, far enough out that there was nothing around us at night except supply vessels, navigation lights, and the occasional flare from another installation on the horizon. My name was Ross Hanley. I had worked offshore for 11 years. I was used to strange-looking weather, lights bending in fog, stars appearing close to the water, and ships seeming to hang above the horizon. Most odd things out there had a normal explanation if you waited long enough. That night was unusually calm. There was a weak current running south, but the sea looked almost flat. The wind had dropped below 5 knots, and the sky was clear, except for a thin strip of cloud far to the east. The moon was nearly full and high above the water. I had gone outside because a vibration alarm had appeared on one of the cooling pumps. It turned out to be a bad sensor, so I reset it and stayed on the walkway for a minute to cool down. The machinery spaces were always hot, even in winter. The first moon reflection looked normal. It formed a broken silver path under the moon, stretching from the horizon toward the platform. The small waves kept breaking it apart. The second reflection sat farther west. At first, I thought it came from a floodlight on the lower deck. It was a dull white oval on the surface, maybe 50 meters across. It did not shimmer like the moon's reflection. The center remained steady while faint light moved around the edges. I leaned over the railing. The oval moved slowly north. That was against the current. It was also moving toward us. I checked the floodlights behind me. None pointed in that direction. I held my hand up to block the moon and nearby lights. The normal reflection disappeared behind my fingers. The second one stayed visible. A mechanic named Dean Hobbs came through the door carrying a mug. He was on the same night shift and had been checking a valve in the next module. I asked him what he thought the light was. He looked over the rail. "What light?" I pointed. It took him several seconds to find it. That patch? I nodded. He watched it move. Could be a vessel below the horizon, he said. A ship's lights could reflect on low cloud or water, but this patch was too close. It moved over the surface, and I could see dark water between it and the horizon. Dean went inside for binoculars. While he was gone, the oval stopped. The sea continued moving beneath it. I could see the current dragging foam and small debris south, but the light stayed fixed. Then it started moving again, this time at the exact speed of a slow walking person. Dean returned and looked through the binoculars. He adjusted the focus several times. "There's nothing making it," he said. He handed them to me. The light looked stranger through magnification. It was not sitting on the surface. It seemed to come from slightly below it, but I could still see the pattern of the waves across the top. The shape was almost circular from our angle, with a faint dark spot near the middle. No boat, buoy, or floating equipment was visible. A narrow line extended behind it like a second reflection trailing through the water. Dean called the control room on his radio. "Control, deck 3 west. Any vessel showing close to the installation?" The operator, Lewis Grant, answered that the marine radar showed nothing within 3 miles except the standby vessel to the southeast. Dean asked whether the underwater inspection drone was in use. Lewis said it was locked in its container. I looked toward the southeast. The standby vessel's navigation lights were visible, but its position did not match the oval. The second reflection moved again. It changed direction without making a curve. One moment it traveled north. The next it moved east, directly toward the platform. Dean lowered the binoculars. "That's coming here." We stood there watching it. It moved steadily across the sea without changing size. That made distance difficult to judge. Sometimes it looked 100 meters away. Then it seemed much closer. The radio clicked. Lewis asked us to confirm whether we had visual contact with an object. Dean said we only saw a light on the water. Lewis told us the platform cameras showed a normal sea surface. I checked the nearest camera. It sat above the door, aimed toward the western approach. A small monitor inside the compressor room displayed its feed. On the screen, the moon's reflection was visible. The second oval was not. We went back outside. It had moved closer. The light now sat almost directly below the crane boom, though still well beyond the platform legs. The dark spot at its center had widened. A low pressure began building in my ears. I swallowed. Dean did the same thing. "You feeling that?" he asked. I said yes. The platform made constant noise from compressors, generators, pumps, and ventilation. After years offshore, you stop noticing most of it. That night, the background sound slowly changed. The high mechanical whine faded. The deeper vibration remained. It felt less like machinery and more like something passing through the steel. I put my hand on the railing. A slow pulse moved through it. 3 beats, a pause, then 2. Dean called control again and asked whether they were running any equipment tests. Lewis said no. The oval light stopped beside the western platform leg. It should have broken apart around the structure. Waves hit the leg and the moonlight moved normally over them, but the second reflection remained smooth. It touched the leg without changing shape. Then, it continued beneath the platform. I walked along the outer walkway to keep it in view. Dean followed. The light passed under the lower deck, where the sea should have been dark from the platform's shadow. Instead, the oval became clearer. It looked pale gray beneath the surface. There was something inside it. Not an object I could identify, just a darker section shaped like a long curve. It reminded me of the shadow of a large fish, but it was much wider than any fish I had seen near the platform. The shape moved under the light without disturbing the water. Dean said, "That's not a reflection." I did not answer. The oval continued toward the center of the structure. We lost sight of it behind pipework and support beams. I expected it to appear on the other side. It did not. The pressure in my ears increased. A metal panel above us started rattling, though there was no wind. Then the vibration passed through the platform. It came from below and traveled upward. The grating under my boots shook. Tools clattered inside the compressor room. A warning light flashed over the door, then went out. The whole event lasted maybe 5 seconds. Afterward, the normal platform noise seemed much louder. Lewis called over the radio. He asked if we had felt an impact. Dean said yes. I said it had not felt like an impact. It had felt like a pressure wave. Lewis told us to return inside while the control room checked the structural monitors. Before we went in, I looked down between the grating. The sea beneath the platform was black. No light remained. There were no ripples spreading outward. Nothing floated to the surface. The normal moon reflection continued farther out, directly below the moon. The second one had vanished. Inside, several alarms had appeared and cleared almost at once. The vibration sensors on 3 platform legs had recorded a short event, but the readings did not match a wave strike or equipment failure. The strongest signal came from the central support column. That column ended in the seabed. Lewis asked whether we had dropped anything. Dean laughed once and said, "Something that lights up 50 meters of sea?" Lewis did not reply. The offshore installation manager, Karen Doyle, came down from her cabin at around 2:30. She reviewed the camera footage and spoke to both of us separately. The recording showed Dean and me standing at the rail and moving along the walkway. It showed the normal moon reflection. The second light did not appear. At 2:17, the image froze for 9 seconds. When it returned, Dean and I were several meters farther along the deck. Neither of us remembered the camera freezing, and the time did not match what I remembered. I thought the vibration happened around 2:12. My watch showed 2:36. The control room clock showed 2:43. Dean's phone matched the control room. My watch was 7 minutes slow. I had checked it at the beginning of the shift, and it had been correct. Karen told us to write statements and not discuss the event over open radio. She said they would check for a small seismic event or an underwater equipment fault. At 3:05, the standby vessel reported interference on its sonar. The captain said a broad contact had appeared beneath the platform and then disappeared. He could not estimate its depth because the signal returned at several levels at once. Karen asked whether it could be a school of fish. The captain said maybe. His tone suggested otherwise. The rest of the shift stayed quiet. At sunrise, a team inspected the lower structure using cameras mounted on long poles. They found no damage. One camera came back with a gray film over the lens. The film smelled metallic, according to the mechanic who cleaned it. At breakfast, Dean sat across from me and said he had seen something when the light passed under the crane. He had not mentioned it earlier. He said that through the binoculars, he saw a row of dark marks inside the oval. They were evenly spaced and moved together. He thought they might have been shadows from the platform legs until the light crossed beneath them. The marks stayed inside the oval. I asked how many. He said 6 or 7. Then he said one of them had moved separately. We did not talk about it after that. The official report came back that afternoon. It blamed the vibration on a small undersea tremor. The light was listed as an optical effect caused by moonlight, calm water, and exhaust haze from the platform. There had been no recorded tremor in the region. The wind had been carrying exhaust east, away from the reflection. I returned to shore 4 days later. My watch remained 7 minutes slow until I replaced the battery. For a while, that was the end of it. 3 months later, I went back to the same platform for another rotation. The weather was rougher, with strong wind and heavy swells. I did not expect to see anything unusual on the water. On the second night, Dean found me in the workshop. He said the marine radar had shown a stationary contact directly beneath the platform for nearly 20 minutes. The sonar on the standby vessel showed nothing. We went outside together around 1. Cloud covered the moon. The sea was dark and broken by white foam. There was no reflection anywhere. Then a pale oval appeared between 2 waves. It stayed level while the water rose and fell around it. The shape moved against the current and stopped below us. Dean raised the binoculars. Before he could focus, every deck light on the western side went out. The oval brightened. For a moment, I could see several dark marks beneath the surface, arranged in a straight line. One of them shifted toward the edge. The radio on my chest clicked. A voice came through, quiet and distorted. It sounded like me saying, "It's under the platform." I had not pressed the transmit button. The vibrations started in the railing. 3 slow pulses. A pause. 2. The oval moved inward beneath the lower deck. This time it did not vanish immediately. A pale glow traveled under the grating below our feet, crossed the center of the platform, and continued toward the eastern side. We ran along the walkway. The glow reached open water beyond the structure. It kept moving east, away from us. The sea above it did not ripple. As it moved farther out, the cloud overhead brightened in the same oval shape. Then the light tilted upward. For several seconds, a dim, curved form seemed to stand between the sea and the cloud, far larger than the reflection had looked. The lower edge left the water without spray. The shape rose into the cloud layer and disappeared. The western deck lights came back on. Dean lowered the binoculars. On the sea below, the normal current carried foam south. A second trail moved east through it, perfectly straight, though nothing remained beneath the surface. The footsteps started around 1:20 in the morning, just after I turned off the television. I was staying at a roadside motel outside Kingman, Arizona, on my way back to California after helping my sister move. I had driven nearly 10 hours that day and did not want to push through the desert at night, so I stopped at the first place that had a vacancy sign in a car park with more than one vehicle in it. The motel was a long, single-story building shaped like an L. My room was near the far end, number 18, with the door and window facing the car park. Behind the building was open desert and a low ridge of dark rock. It had been hot when I arrived, but the temperature dropped quickly after midnight. The air conditioner rattled every few minutes and then went quiet. Trucks passed on the highway in the distance, making a low rolling sound that faded slowly. My name was Marissa Cole. I was 34 at the time and worked in payroll for a medical supply company. I was not someone who usually stayed awake worrying about strange noises. I had lived in apartments with thin walls for years. I knew what footsteps, pipes, animals, and people dragging luggage sounded like. These footsteps sounded like a person walking slowly past my room. The first step came from near the door, then another, then another. They were heavy enough to make a faint scrape on the concrete walkway, but not heavy like boots, more like bare feet or soft-soled shoes. I assumed another guest was going to the vending machine. The steps moved past my window toward the end of the building. The curtains were closed, but a narrow gap remained where the two sides did not meet. I got out of bed and looked through it. The walkway was empty. A yellow light above the next room lit the concrete all the way to the corner. There was nowhere for anyone to hide without moving into the car park. I waited. The footsteps continued. That was the first thing I could not explain. Beyond my window, the concrete walkway ended at the outer wall of room 19. There was no path around the corner. The building ended there, with a drop of maybe 3 feet down to gravel and weeds. The footsteps did not stop at the end. They continued across the wall. I heard one step beside the window of room 19, then the next slightly higher, followed by another near the top of the wall. The sound moved upward in the same slow rhythm. I stood there with my face close to the curtain, trying to understand what I was hearing. A cat could climb a wall, but it would scratch and scramble. A person would need a ladder. The sound was steady, one step every 2 seconds, as if someone was walking up an ordinary set of stairs. The steps reached the roof. The thin metal edge above the rooms gave a faint creak. Then something walked back in my direction, directly over the ceiling. I stepped away from the window. The footsteps passed above room 19, then stopped over my bathroom. Dust fell from the vent. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, though I had never heard a raccoon walk with such even spacing. The motel roof looked flat from the car park, so something could have climbed up from the rear. Then the steps moved across the ceiling and stopped above the bed. I could see a slight dent form in one of the acoustic tiles. It was small, no larger than a fist. The tile flexed downward and slowly returned to shape. I picked up my phone and called the front desk. A man answered after 6 rings. His name was Wayne, according to the paper sleeve around my keycard. I told him there was someone walking on the roof. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Probably a bird." I said it sounded much too heavy. He asked whether anyone was trying the door or window. I said no. He told me he would look outside. I stayed on the phone while he left the office. Through the curtain gap, I saw the front desk door open near the other end of the building. A man in a blue shirt came out carrying a flashlight. He walked into the car park and aimed the beam across the roof. The footsteps stopped. Wayne stood there for maybe 30 seconds, sweeping the light back and forth. He said he did not see anything. I asked him to check behind the building. He said there was a locked service gate and no walkway on that side. He sounded annoyed, but agreed to look. The moment he disappeared around the far corner, the footsteps started again above me. One step. A pause. Another step. They moved toward the door. Then they came down the front wall. I heard the sound travel from the roof edge to the top of the window, then lower beside the glass. The curtain moved inward slightly. The window was closed. I held my breath. A soft pressure pushed against the glass, not a knock, more like someone resting a hand or forehead against it. The curtain fabric pulled toward the window and stayed there for a second. Then the pressure released. Wayne came back into view. The footsteps stopped again. He called through the phone and said the rear area was empty. He had checked the roof line and found no ladder, animal, or person. I asked whether there was roof access from inside the motel. He said only from a locked maintenance hatch near the laundry room. I asked if he could move me to another room. He sighed and said the motel was nearly full, but he had a room near the office if I wanted to change. I said yes. I started putting my things back in my suitcase. While I packed, something walked slowly past the door from left to right. This time, I watched the bottom gap. No shadow crossed it. The footsteps reached the window. One step sounded directly outside. The next sounded inside the wall. I stopped moving. A faint tapping began behind the headboard. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. The headboard was bolted to the wall. On the other side was open desert. There was no adjoining room. I took my shoes and suitcase and went to the door. Before opening it, I looked through the peephole. The car park was empty. Wayne stood near the office, holding the flashlight and looking in my direction. I opened the door and walked out quickly. The cold air smelled like dust and petrol. I pulled the door shut and started toward the office. Halfway there, Wayne raised one hand. "Ma'am," he said. He was looking behind me. I turned. The curtain in my room had opened. Only a few inches, but enough to make a narrow, dark gap. I had left it closed. The room light was still on. I could see part of the bed and the television. Nothing stood inside. Then a tall shadow moved across the curtain from right to left. It crossed the lit fabric without any visible body passing through the room. Wayne saw it. He lowered the flashlight. "Did you leave somebody in there?" I said no. He walked toward the room, moving faster now. I stayed several steps behind him. He unlocked the door with his MasterCard and pushed it open. The room was empty. The bathroom door stood open. The shower curtain was still. The closet contained only empty hangers. The curtain by the window had been pulled apart at the center. Wayne checked the window lock. It was secure. He looked under the bed and behind the bathroom door. Then he stood in the middle of the room, listening. The tapping came again from behind the headboard. 3 taps. A pause. 2. Wayne stepped back. I asked what was on the other side of the wall. He said nothing, just the back lot. He pressed his ear against the wall. The tapping stopped. A low sound moved through the room. It was almost below hearing, a vibration that made the mirror tremble and the plastic cups beside the sink rattle against each other. Wayne backed away from the wall. The ceiling tile above the bed bent downward. Not much, maybe an inch. It moved in a long oval area, wider than a person's shoulders. The air conditioner shut off. The room became completely quiet except for the vibration. Something crossed the ceiling from the bed toward the door. The tiles flexed one after another. No footsteps now, just a smooth pressure moving above them. Wayne told me to leave my things and go to the office. We walked out together and locked the door. As we crossed the car park, a light came on behind the curtain in room 18. Not the lamp. The room was already lit. This was a pale white glow, higher and wider than the window. It filled the curtain from behind and made the fabric look almost transparent. A long shape stood inside the light. It was narrow at the top and wider near the middle. It did not have clear arms or a head, but it was close enough to a person's outline that my brain kept trying to make it one. The shape leaned toward the window. Wayne shone the flashlight at it. The beam reflected off the glass. The pale glow went out. The room returned to normal yellow light. The shape was gone. Wayne did not go back inside. He moved me to room 3 beside the office and refunded the cost of the night without me asking. He also called the local sheriff's department. A deputy arrived around 2. His name was Alvarez. He checked room 18, the roof access, the back lot, and the gravel beneath the windows. The ground was dry but soft enough to hold tracks. He found ours and Wayne's. Nothing else. There were no animal prints near the wall, and no marks showing anyone had climbed onto the roof. The maintenance hatch was still locked from the inside. Deputy Alvarez said old motel buildings made strange noises when the temperature changed. Metal expanded and contracted. Animals could move through roof spaces without being visible. Wayne asked how an animal opened the curtain. The deputy did not answer that. They let me collect my suitcase while both of them stood in the room. The headboard did not tap again. The ceiling tiles looked normal. I slept in room 3 with the lights on. At 4:11, I woke to slow footsteps outside. They moved along the walkway from the office toward my room. I sat up and listened. One step every 2 seconds. They passed the front desk window. Then room 1, then room 2. They stopped outside my door. I looked at the gap along the bottom. No shadow. The handle did not move. A faint pressure touched the window beside the bed. The curtain shifted inward. I did not get up. The footsteps continued past the window. Room 3 was at the corner of the building. Beyond it, the walkway turned toward the vending machines and ice machine. The steps did not turn. They moved straight across the outer wall. I heard them climb upward, one beside the window, one near the roofline. Then the ceiling above me gave a soft creak. I called Wayne. The office phone rang through the wall. He answered immediately. I told him it was on the roof again. Before he could reply, a deep vibration passed through the motel. The walls rattled. The bedside lamp dimmed. The pressure in my ears increased until I swallowed hard. Outside, car alarms flashed without sounding. The vibration moved from the rear of the building toward the highway. As it passed over my room, the footsteps stopped. A bright white flash filled the gap around the curtains. There was no thunder. The light lasted less than a second. Afterward, the air conditioner started. The car alarm stopped flashing and normal road noise returned. Wayne knocked on my door with the deputy beside him. Alvarez had stayed to finish his report. We checked outside together. Nothing was on the roof. The sky was clear. A truck passed on the highway. No more footsteps came. I left at sunrise. The car park was covered in a thin layer of pale desert dust that had settled after the rain earlier that week. My car had been parked outside room 18 all night. The dust covered the roof, bonnet, and windows evenly, except for one clean oval patch. It was on the passenger side of the roof, about 1 meter long and half a meter wide. The metal inside the oval looked polished. There were no handprints or wipe marks around it. The dust ended along a smooth edge, as if something had rested there without touching the rest of the car. I opened the passenger door and checked the interior. Everything was where I had left it. On the inside of the roof lining, directly beneath the clean oval, the fabric felt warm. Wayne took a photograph. My phone camera would not focus on it. Every picture showed the dust, but the clean patch appeared blurred. I drove away before 7. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then I stopped at a petrol station near Needles. While I filled the tank, I heard slow footsteps move along the passenger side of the car. I looked underneath it. No one was there. The steps reached the rear door, continued across the metal body, and moved onto the roof. The clean oval above the passenger seat darkened for a second, as if something blocked the morning sun. When I looked up, the sky was empty. The geese broke formation at 6:38 in the morning, just as I was locking the back gate. I lived on the edge of the fens, outside a village near Ely. My house backed onto flat farmland and a drainage channel, so I saw large groups of geese passing over most autumn mornings. They usually came across in clean V shapes, low enough that I could hear their wings before I saw them. That morning was cold and clear. The sun had not fully come up, but the eastern sky was pale orange, and there was almost no wind. A thin strip of cloud sat far to the west. Everything overhead was blue and empty. I had stepped outside to put a bag in the bin before driving to work. The geese came from the north, maybe 60 or 70 of them. They were flying lower than usual, no more than a few hundred feet up. Their calls were loud and steady. Then the formation split. It happened so fast that I thought one of the lead birds had been struck. The front half turned sharply left. The rear half turned right. Both groups banked hard around the same patch of empty sky. The birds at the center scattered in different directions. Several dropped lower. Others climbed almost vertically, beating their wings in a way I had never seen geese do. They were not avoiding a plane. There was no aircraft sound, and nothing moved between them. Both groups circled the same area. The left group made a wide turn and came back. The right group did the same from the other side. When they reached the empty patch again, they broke apart a second time. The noise changed. Geese normally called in a rough, uneven pattern. These sounded distressed. The calls became short and rapid, and some of the birds stopped calling altogether. I stood beside the gate, watching. My neighbor, Peter Halden, came out of his shed carrying a red petrol can. He followed my line of sight. "What are they doing?" he asked. I said I did not know. The geese circled again. They kept a clear space between them, roughly oval and maybe 30 meters wide. The birds nearest the edge tilted away from it, even when their formation should have carried them straight through. One goose flew too close. It dropped suddenly, not like it had been shot, but as if the air beneath it had disappeared. It fell maybe 20 feet, recovered, and turned back toward the others. Peter put down the can. We both looked for anything in the sky that could explain it. There were no wires, no balloons, no drone, and no visible aircraft. The light was good enough that we could see individual feathers on the lower birds. I took out my phone and started recording. On the screen, the geese looked smaller, but the empty space between them was obvious. The camera struggled to focus whenever I aimed directly at the center. The birds at the edges became sharp, then blurred. The blue sky inside the oval looked slightly darker on the screen than it did with my eyes. I wiped the lens and tried again. Same thing. The geese abandoned their route. Instead of continuing south, the entire group turned east in a broken line and flew toward the river. They did not reform into a proper V. They stayed spread out and low, calling loudly. A few seconds after they left, the cloud band moved in. It was thin and high, the kind that usually stretched in a straight line across the sky. The leading edge reached the place where the birds had circled. The cloud bent. It did not pass through the empty section. The narrow band split around it, one part curving above and the other below. The cloud kept moving west to east, but the gap remained fixed. For several seconds, the invisible space became outlined by white. Peter said, "There's something there." I could see what he meant. The cloud wrapped around a long oval shape standing at a slight angle. The upper edge looked smooth. The lower edge narrowed near one end. It was much larger than I had assumed from the geese. The outlines stretched across a section of sky wider than our house. Then the cloud passed. The shape disappeared. Nothing else moved overhead. Peter asked whether I had recorded it. I checked the video. It showed the geese splitting and circling. When the cloud reached the empty patch, the image broke into gray squares. The recording returned after the cloud had already passed. There were 6 missing seconds. I played it again. Same gap. Peter's phone had been in his shed, so he had no second recording. We stood outside for another minute. The morning stayed quiet. The geese did not return. I went to work in Cambridge and spent most of the drive thinking about what we had seen. I worked in a vehicle parts warehouse, and by 8 I had convinced myself it was probably a strong pocket of rising air or some kind of pressure change. Birds reacted to things people could not feel. Maybe the cloud had bent because of the same air movement. That explanation held until Peter called me at 9:17. He said the drainage water behind our houses had changed. I asked what he meant. He said a smooth patch had appeared in the channel directly below where the geese had circled. The channel was about 10 meters wide and usually moved slowly toward the pumping station. Even on calm days, the surface showed small ripples from insects, fish, and reeds. Peter said the new patch was completely still. I told him to take a picture. He sent one while we were talking. The water looked normal except for an oval area near the center. It was darker than the rest, with a thin, bright line around one edge. Peter said the oval was moving upstream. I left work at lunchtime and drove home. The sky had clouded over by then. A light wind pushed across the fields and the water in the channel had become rougher. The oval patch was gone. Peter had marked the bank opposite it with a stick. We searched the mud for tracks or signs of someone launching a small boat. There were none. The reeds near the mark leaned outward in 2 directions. as though something wide had passed between them without touching the water. Peter told me he had heard a clicking sound after I left. 3 quick clicks, a pause, then 2 slower ones. He thought it came from above the channel. I asked whether he had seen anything. He said no, but every dog in the nearby houses had started barking at the same time. We walked along the bank for about half a mile. Near a footbridge, we found 6 dead geese. They were arranged in a loose line along the far side of the channel. None had visible injuries. Their wings were folded and their necks stretched toward the water. I recognized one from the morning because it had a white patch on one wing. Peter called the local wildlife office. A woman named Hannah Vickers arrived around 3. She wore waterproof trousers and carried plastic bags and gloves. She examined the birds and said there were no signs of shooting, poisoning, or attack. She thought they might have struck power lines, but the nearest line was over a mile away. We told her about the flock splitting in the sky. She listened politely, but did not comment. When she moved the first bird, a narrow gray mark showed in the grass beneath it. The mark curved toward the channel. There was one beneath each goose. Together, the lines formed part of a large oval. Hannah stopped collecting the birds. She took photographs and called someone from her office. While she spoke, the reeds across the water began moving. The wind blew from the west, but the reeds bent north in a clean sequence, one group after another. Something invisible traveled along the bank. The movement reached the footbridge. The metal rail gave a low vibration. I felt it through my hand before I realized I was touching it. The sound was not loud. It sat below normal hearing, more like pressure in my jaw. Hannah ended her call. She asked if heavy farm machinery was operating nearby. There was a tractor in a field to the south, but it was moving away from us. The vibration increased. A row of small ripples formed in the channel. They moved upstream against the current. Peter stepped back from the bridge. The water beneath us darkened into an oval patch. It was the same shape he had photographed that morning. This time, it was larger. It passed under the bridge without touching the supports. The surface above it stayed flat, while the rest of the channel moved around it. Hannah raised her phone. The screen went black. My phone lost signal. The oval continued north. As it moved away, the reeds leaned toward it. The dead geese on the bank shifted slightly, not their bodies. Their feathers lifted and pointed in the direction of the moving patch. Then the vibration stopped. The water returned to normal. Hannah put the birds into bags and left without saying much. Before she drove away, she asked us to email any videos or photographs. That evening, I sent her the clip from the morning. The file failed 3 times before sending. She replied the next day and said the video contained no missing frames. According to her, it showed the cloud passing normally through the space between the geese. I opened my copy. The 6-second gap was still there. The dead birds were taken for testing. A week later, Hannah said the results were inconclusive. There was no infection, toxin, or physical injury that explained why they died. Peter and I did not see the shape again for almost a month. By then, most geese had moved farther south. The mornings were darker and frost covered the fields. I was outside at 7:02 one morning when I heard the calls. A smaller group flew in from the north. They approached in a clean V. As they reached the area above the channel, the front birds changed direction. The flock split exactly as before. This time they did not circle. They turned back north immediately. One bird continued straight. It passed into the empty section of sky. For less than a second, its body disappeared. The wings remained visible on either side, beating around a space where the center should have been. Then, the whole bird reappeared. It dropped sharply and flew away from the others toward the east. A pale line formed in the air behind it. Condensation spread around something large and oval. The shape was lower than it had been the first time, close enough that I could compare it with the trees. It was at least the length of 2 buses. The white outline held for several seconds. Inside it, the sky looked darker and slightly distorted. A row of small gray marks appeared along one side. They were evenly spaced. One of them darkened. Something narrow moved behind it. Peter came out when the dog started barking. He saw the final part of the outline before it faded. The clicking began overhead. 3 quick sounds, a pause, 2 slower ones. The shape moved south. We could not see it directly, but we watched the effect pass across the landscape. A strip of frost disappeared from the field beneath it. A line of trees bent at their tops without wind. Clouds farther south separated around an invisible oval and joined again behind it. The movement continued toward the horizon. Then, everything stopped. My watch showed 7:11. My phone showed 7:24. Peter's kitchen clock showed 7:11. The local radio news gave the time as 7:24. That afternoon, a farmer named Colin Webb found a long depression in a field 2 miles south of us. Nothing had landed there, and the crop was not broken. The stems had simply leaned outward around an empty oval. There were no tire marks or footprints. At the center, he found a small pile of gray feathers arranged in a narrow ring. I went to look before he plowed the field. The feathers all pointed inward. As I stood near the edge, a shadow moved across the ground. The sky above was clear. The shadow slowed when I stopped walking. When I stepped back, it moved with me. I returned to my car and drove home. For the next few weeks, geese avoided the area completely. They passed east or west of the village, even when strong wind pushed them off their usual routes. One morning in December, I found a single bird standing beside the drainage channel. It did not appear injured. It faced the sky and made no sound. I approached slowly. The goose turned its head and looked at me. Then it looked upward again. A narrow band of cloud came from the west. The bird stepped away from the water. The cloud reached the same empty section of sky and bent around it. This time, the invisible shape was directly above my house. The windows rattled once. The goose lowered its body to the ground. A deep vibration passed through the soil. The cloud curved around the oval, outlining its full length. At the lower end, a faint dark opening appeared. Several pale marks moved inside it. The shape tilted. For a moment, the whole sky above the garden seemed to bend with it. Then the cloud snapped back into a straight line. The vibration stopped. The goose stood, crossed the lane, and flew low toward the east. On the grass where it had been sitting, 5 small feathers formed a neat curve. By the time I reached the back door, my watch was 13 minutes slow. The first temperature alert came through at 11:43 on a Thursday night. I was asleep on the sofa in the office at our vineyard when the tablet started vibrating against the desk. We had a hard freeze forecast, so I had stayed on site to monitor the frost fans and irrigation lines. My wife, Eliza, was at home with our daughter, about 20 minutes away. The vineyard sat outside Walla Walla, Washington, on a low slope with wheat fields to the north and a narrow creek along the southern boundary. We grew mostly Cabernet and Syrah. In late March, the vines had just started budding, which made a freeze dangerous enough to wipe out a large part of the crop. My name was Aaron Bell. I managed the property for a family who lived in Seattle and visited maybe 4 times a year. Most nights it was just me, 2 seasonal workers in a trailer near the equipment shed, and a lot of empty land. The alert said sensor 14 had climbed from 26 degrees to 41 in less than a minute. I assumed the sensor had failed. It was mounted at the western edge of Block C, near the road. I checked the other readings. Sensors 13 and 15 still showed 25 degrees. Wind speed was almost 0. Humidity was high, and the frost fans had started automatically. I reset the warning. 30 seconds later, sensor 15 jumped to 40 degrees. Sensor 14 had already dropped back to 26. The warm reading had moved east. I sat up and opened the field map. We had temperature sensors every 40 meters in the main blocks. They were simple weather units fixed to posts about chest height. The warm readings continued in order. Sensor 16, then 17. Each one rose for less than a minute, then returned to normal as the next sensor warmed. It looked like a narrow strip of heat moving steadily through Block C. I called Mateo Ruiz, who stayed in the trailer with his brother, Luis. Mateo answered, sounding half awake. I asked whether they had turned on any equipment. He said no. I told him to look outside and see if a vehicle was moving through the west rows. The line stayed quiet for a few seconds. No headlights, he said. Any smoke? No. Sensor 18 climbed. The warm strip was moving directly toward the equipment shed. I pulled on my boots and coat. Outside, the cold hit hard enough to make my eyes water. Frost had already formed on the gravel. The fans turned slowly above the vines, pushing the air with a low chopping sound. The sky was clear. The moon sat low over the western hills, bright enough that I could see most of Block C without a torch. Nothing moved between the rows. I walked toward sensor 18. By the time I reached it, the reading had fallen. The metal post felt cold. Frost covered the small solar panel and the leaves around it. Mateo and Luis came down from the trailer carrying flashlights. I showed them the map. Sensor 19 had warmed. That one stood just beyond the equipment shed. The line connecting the readings was perfectly straight. It had crossed the dirt road, 2 rows of vines, and a drainage ditch without slowing. We walked around the shed. There was no heat source on the other side, no vehicle tracks, no leaking pipe. The generator was off. Luis pointed at the roof. A narrow strip of frost had melted across the corrugated metal. It ran from the western edge to the eastern edge in a straight line about 3 meters wide. Outside that strip, the roof was white. Inside it, the metal was wet and dark. Mateo asked if an electrical cable ran beneath it. There were no cables on that part of the roof. I climbed the ladder and touched the wet metal. It was warm enough that water had not refrozen. The strip continued down the eastern wall. The wood siding looked normal, but the frost had melted in the same narrow band. The warmth had passed directly through the building. I went inside. The shed held tractors, sprayers, tools, and spare irrigation parts. Nothing was running. A line of condensation crossed the concrete floor from west to east. It went under a parked tractor and emerged on the other side without changing width. The tractor's engine block felt cold. The metal hood along the line felt slightly warm. Mateo stood near the open door, looking out toward the vines. "The plants are moving," he said. We went outside. A section of vines in Block D bent eastward. There was no wind strong enough to do it. The frost fans were farther south, and their airflow did not reach that area. The movement traveled along one narrow path. Vines bent as it approached, held for a second, then returned upright after it passed. The support wires trembled, but no visible body moved between them. It crossed the block at a steady walking speed. I opened the security cameras on the tablet. Camera 4 showed Block D from a pole near the shed. The vines were clearly bending in a line. Nothing appeared above them. The camera image distorted where the movement passed. The rows behind it seemed to shift sideways for a second, like they were being viewed through thick glass. Then the picture returned to normal. Sensor 20 warmed. The strip continued east toward the barrel room. I called the sheriff's non-emergency number. I did not know how to explain it. I said there might be a trespasser or an equipment problem moving through the vineyard. The dispatcher asked what kind of equipment. I said I was not sure. She told me a deputy would check the property when available. The warm strip crossed a wire fence. The fence did not break, but every strand bowed forward at once. The metal posts remained still. A light layer of frost vanished from 3 meters of wire, then reformed behind it. Luis walked closer. Mateo told him to stay back. The air in front of us looked normal, but I could feel pressure in my ears. It grew as the movement came near, then weakened after it passed. The temperature around us remained below freezing, only the narrow strip warmed. A low clicking sound started somewhere in the rows. 3 clicks, a pause, 2. It repeated from farther east, then again from behind us. I checked the frost fans. Their rhythm had not changed. The sound did not seem mechanical. It was too sharp and dry, like 2 stones being tapped together. Camera 5 went offline. That camera stood beside the barrel room. The temperature sensor there climbed to 43 degrees. We drove over in the utility cart. The barrel room was a concrete building with thick insulated walls. It stayed close to 55 degrees year-round. If the warm strip crossed it, the sensors inside should not have noticed. They did. One internal sensor rose by 9 degrees, then dropped again. The reading moved from west to east through the building. I unlocked the door. Inside, the air smelled of oak and wine. Rows of barrels sat on metal racks. The overhead lights flickered when I switched them on. A thin line of moisture ran across the western wall. It continued over the floor beneath 2 racks of barrels and up the opposite wall. The concrete along the strip was warm. 1 barrel sat directly in its path. Wine seeped from around the wooden bung, though the seal was tight. I touched the barrel. The staves were cold, except for 1 vertical band facing west. That section felt almost body temperature. Something tapped from inside the barrel, 3 times. then twice. Luis moved toward it. I told him not to touch it. The barrel gave a low creak. The warm band shifted across its curved surface and disappeared on the eastern side. At the same time, the next sensor outside warmed. Whatever it was had passed through. We left the building and locked it. The strip was heading toward the oldest block, but where the vines were thicker and the ground sloped toward the creek. The security system showed its path clearly. Each camera lost focus as it crossed, then returned with no image of what caused the movement. On camera 7, the frost on the ground melted in a long oval patch. The shape looked wider than the warm strip itself, maybe 15 meters long. The vines bent around it. They did not bend away like they were hit by wind. They pressed downward, as if something heavy but invisible moved just above them. One support post snapped. The wooden post broke near the base and fell after the shape passed. That was the only physical damage we saw. The warm strip reached the creek fence. Then it stopped. Every temperature reading remained steady. The clicking stopped too. For nearly 2 minutes, nothing happened. We stood beside the utility cart, listening to the frost fans. Mateo said he could see something over the creek. I followed where he pointed. The moonlight reflected off a patch of mist above the water. The night had been too dry and cold for much fog, but a pale oval had formed just beyond the fence. It hung low, no more than a few meters above the creek. The mist moved around an empty center. It was like steam wrapping around a shape we could not see. The outline appeared slowly. It was long and slightly tilted, with one end narrower than the other. It extended beyond the width of the warm strip. The air beneath it looked darker. I could see trees through the center, but their trunks appeared bent and stretched. Luis whispered something in Spanish. The clicking began again, this time above us. The frost fans slowed. Their motors still ran, but the blades turned as if the air had become thicker. My phone screen went black. The tablet stayed on, but the temperature map changed. Every sensor showed the same number, 37 degrees. The time in the corner froze at 12:09. I checked my watch. It showed 12:14. The pale oval moved away from the creek. It did not rise or drift with the air. It slid sideways over the vineyard, back along the same line it had followed before. The vines bent beneath it. This time, we could see the lower outline because frost lifted from the leaves and collected around the invisible surface. The shape passed above the fence without touching it. The wire bowed anyway. It moved toward us. We stepped behind the utility cart. The temperature rose, not gradually. One moment the air hurt my face from cold. The next it felt like standing near an open garage on a summer day. The frost on the cart melted in a 3-meter strip. Water ran upward across the windshield. The oval stopped over the road. It was larger than the cart and probably larger than the barrel room. A row of dim gray marks appeared along its side. They were not lights exactly. They looked like sections where the darkness had thinned. One mark changed shape. Something narrow crossed behind it. I saw a vertical outline, pale against the gray patch. It stopped near the center and seemed to turn toward us. Mateo's radio activated. A voice came through the static. It said my first name, Aaron. The voice sounded like Eliza. I picked up my phone, but the screen remained black. The radio said my name again. Then it said Mateo. Then Luis. The order matched where we stood beside the cart. Luis backed away. The oval shifted slightly toward him. The vines behind us bent in a line pointing at his position. I grabbed his sleeve and pulled him back. The shape remained over the road. A deep vibration passed through the ground. It was not loud, but I felt it in my legs and chest. The cart's mirrors shook. Ice fell from the support wires. The nearest camera pole leaned toward the oval and then returned upright. The vibration moved east through the property. Sensor 21 rose, then 22. The warm strip had started moving again, leaving the oval behind. That made no sense. Until then, I had assumed the heat and the shape were the same thing. Now the heat traveled toward the far boundary, while the mist-outlined form remained above us. The gray marks along its side darkened one by one. The last mark stayed visible. The narrow shape behind it raised one side of its body. It might have been an arm. The radio clicked 3 times. A pause. 2. A bright flash came from the eastern field. There was no sound. For less than a second, the whole vineyard turned white. Every wire, vine, building, and fence appeared as a sharp black line against the light. The oval above the road vanished. The warm strip disappeared from the sensors. The fans returned to normal speed. My phone came back on. The time showed 12:28. I had no memory of 14 minutes passing. The tablet log showed the warm strip crossing the entire vineyard in 22 minutes. My memory of the event was closer to an hour. The sheriff's deputy arrived at 12:41. His name was Cole Mercer. He checked the property with us and listened without interrupting while I explained the sensors, bent vines, and missing camera footage. He looked doubtful until we reached the barrel room. The warm strip remained visible across the frost on the roof and walls. Inside, the damp line across the floor had dried. The barrel that tapped was still leaking. Cole touched the warm band on the wood. He removed his hand immediately. The rest of the barrel was cold. We checked the eastern boundary where the flash had appeared. The strip ended in an open wheat field. There were no tracks. The frozen soil showed no tire marks, footprints, or animal prints. A line of melted frost continued for about 30 meters beyond the last vineyard sensor, then stopped in a perfect oval. At the center of that oval, the ground was dry and warm. Cole used his flashlight to examine it. Dozens of small moths lay in a narrow ring around the edge. They were dead, with their wings open. There should not have been moths active on a freezing March night. The official report blamed faulty sensors and wind damage. The sheriff's office listed the moths as an unrelated natural event. Our security company inspected the cameras. They found no equipment faults. The recordings showed the vines bending and the fence wires bowing. They showed the frost melting across the buildings. They did not show the mist outline or the gray marks. At 12:09, all 8 cameras skipped forward 14 minutes. The system clock did not report an error. The barrel room sensor failed 2 days later. When I removed it from the wall, I found the plastic casing had turned smooth and gray along one narrow side. The affected vines grew normally that spring, except for a 3-meter wide path through each block. Those plants budded early. Their leaves all faced east, even on the western sides of the rows. In May, I was walking the property alone just before sunrise when my radio clicked 3 times. A pause. 2. The temperature alert sounded on my phone. Sensor 14 had climbed to 41 degrees. Then sensor 15 warmed. Across Block C, the vines began bending in sequence beneath something I could not see. The first tone appeared on the hydrophone at 3:07 in the morning, about 200 miles west of the Outer Hebrides. I was working aboard a marine survey vessel called the North Calder. We were mapping a section of deep water for a cable route, which meant running slow lines back and forth while the sonar team watched screens and argued about seabed quality. My name was Ian Mercer. I was an acoustic technician, not a scientist. I maintained the hydrophones, checked the recording equipment, and made sure the data reached the people who understood it better than I did. That night, the sea was calm but not flat. Long swells moved under us from the northwest. The sky was overcast and there was no moon visible. Most of the crew were asleep except for the bridge watch, 2 engineers, and 3 of us in the survey room. The first sound looked like a narrow line on the display. It started below the range we normally monitored, close to the bottom of the graph, then climbed steadily through the frequencies. I heard it through my headset a second later. It was a clean tone, low and smooth, rising quickly. At first I thought it was a whale call. We recorded whales often. Their sounds could bend, pulse, and sweep across a wide range. This did not have the rough texture of an animal sound. It was too even. The tone rose for about 8 seconds and stopped. Tamsin Hall, the night surveyor, looked over from the next desk. "What was that?" I replayed it. The tone began deep enough to feel in the ear cushions, then climbed until it became a thin whistle and disappeared above the playback range. Tamsin asked where it came from. I checked the array. The strongest arrival was directly beneath the ship. The depth estimate made no sense. The software placed the source somewhere below 4,000 meters, close to the seabed. I ran the calculation again. Same result. Our water depth was just over 4,300 meters. If the estimate was right, the sound had started near the bottom and moved upward. That was not unusual by itself. Whales rose, gas bubbles rose, equipment could move through the water column. What was unusual was the speed. The source calculation suggested it had covered several kilometers in less than 10 seconds. I assumed the software had misread a fixed source whose frequency was increasing. Then the tone came again. This time the line on the display started slightly lower. The sweep lasted 9 seconds. The hydrophone array tracked it upward. Tamsin watched the depth readout change. 4,000 meters, 3,000, 2,000, 1,000. Then the source estimate reached 0, sea level. The tone did not stop. The frequency continued rising after the software said the source had passed the surface. The tracking display flashed an error, and Tamsin took off her headphones. That can't happen. I said the array had probably lost the source near the surface and continued following a reflection. She asked a reasonable question. Reflection off what? There was thick cloud above us, but no aircraft nearby, according to the bridge radar. The sea surface could reflect sound back downward, not carry it upward. I called the bridge. The officer of the watch was a man named Ben Sayer. I asked whether they had any close traffic or aircraft. He said the nearest vessel was 14 miles south and no aircraft were showing. I told him we had an unusual acoustic contact directly below the ship. He asked if it was biological. I said probably. That was easier than explaining what the screen showed. The tone returned at 312. It was louder. All 3 hydrophone channels recorded it at once. The rise began near the seabed, traveled up the water column, reached the surface, then continued beyond the top limit of our tracking system. The sound did not weaken as it rose, it became stronger. A mug on my desk trembled when the low part passed through. The deck vibrated faintly beneath my boots. Tamsin called in Dr. Syra Malik, the project acoustics lead. Syra had been asleep for less than 2 hours and arrived wearing a fleece over her pajamas. She listened to the last recording twice. Her first suggestion was machinery noise from our own vessel. I showed her the engine and propeller frequencies. They were separate and steady. She asked the bridge to reduce speed. Ben brought us from 4 knots to 2. The background noise dropped. The rising tone remained. Syra opened the raw waveform and removed every automatic filter. The signal looked almost perfectly clean. There was no obvious modulation, no breaks, and no pattern inside it. Just one continuous sweep from very low frequency into a range our hydrophones should not have been able to track well. She asked when it had started. I told her 3:07. The ship's clock showed 3:15. My watch showed 3:13. The screen. I assumed it was slow. The next sweep began before we finished checking. This one took 11 seconds. It moved more slowly through the lower water column, then accelerated near the surface. The system estimated the source directly below the keel. I felt pressure in my ears. The ship gave a small roll even though the sea had not changed. Ben called from the bridge. He asked whether we had activated any high-power acoustic equipment. We had not. He said the compass repeater had shifted 6 degrees and returned. Syra muted the hydrophone feed. The tone continued through the survey room speakers. I pulled the main audio connection. The sound continued. For a few seconds, it seemed to come through the walls rather than the equipment. Then it faded. No one spoke. A technician named Joel Pierce came in from the cable room and asked why the passageway floor was humming. Syra told him to wake the chief engineer. At 3:19, the tone appeared again. This time the lights dimmed during the lower part of the sweep. A line of static crossed every monitor. The depth track climbed. 4,000 meters, 3,000, 1,000, 500, 0. The moment it reached sea level, something struck the underside of the hull. It was not a hard impact. It felt like a broad pressure wave lifting the ship. The floor rose gently under us and settled. Several alarms sounded, then cleared before anyone could read them. I expected to hear water breaking outside or something scraping along the hull. Instead, the rising tone continued. It passed above the hydrophone range. Then we heard it from the deck head. A faint whistle moved upward through the ship. Joel looked at the ceiling. The sound crossed the survey room from below to above, as if something had traveled straight through the vessel without touching it. Ben ordered everyone not required below deck to report to the main work deck. By the time we reached the stairs, most of the night crew were awake. The chief engineer, Gordon Pike, said there was no hull damage and no flooding. The engine systems were normal. On deck, the air was cold and still. Cloud covered the sky from horizon to horizon. The ship's floodlights made a white circle on the sea around us. Nothing floated nearby. No bubbles, no disturbed water. The crew gathered along the rail, looking down. The next sweep started at 3:24. We heard the low part through the steel deck before the hydrophone report came over Syra's radio. The vibration rose through my boots. A pale circle formed on the sea beneath the starboard crane. It was not light. It looked like the water had become smoother in one area. The circle expanded until it was wider than the ship. Several deckhands moved away from the rail. The tone rose. The smooth patch tightened into an oval. The surrounding water continued lifting with the swell, but the oval stayed level. I expected something to break the surface. Everyone did. Gordon told 2 deckhands to prepare the emergency floodlights. Ben ordered the ship stopped. The propellers slowed. The tone climbed higher. The oval surface darkened. For 1 second, I saw a shape below it. It was broad and pale, deeper than the light reached. I could not see an outline, only a difference in the water, like a large section of the sea had changed density. The source estimate reached 100 meters, 50, 10, 0. The smooth patch on the surface did not break. The tone passed through sea level. A pressure wave hit the deck. My coat pressed against my body as if air had rushed upward, but the flags on the mast did not move. The sound emerged above us. Several people shouted at once. A high, thin whistle traveled from the deck toward the cloud. It moved fast enough that I had to tilt my head back immediately to follow it. There was nothing visible. The cloud remained dark and flat. The whistle continued climbing, becoming fainter as though the source was moving farther into the sky. Then it stopped. The smooth oval on the sea vanished without a ripple. The waves closed over it normally. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Ben called the bridge and asked for radar and weather reports. Nothing appeared on radar. No lightning had been detected. No aircraft had passed overhead. The ship's clocks showed 3:29. My watch showed 3:17. I had lost 12 minutes somewhere, though I remembered the whole sequence continuously. Gordon checked my watch against his phone. It had not stopped. The second hand moved normally. Several others had time differences too. Joel's phone was 9 minutes slow. One deckhand's digital watch had reset to midnight. Syra's tablet showed the correct time, but the acoustic recording listed the final sweep as lasting 43 seconds. We had heard it for less than 15. Ben kept us stopped while the engineers inspected the hull. A remotely operated camera was lowered over the side. The water beneath the ship looked normal until the camera reached 80 meters. Then the video developed a faint gray ring around the edges. At 120 meters, the camera lost picture. The cable tension dropped for 3 seconds, as though the unit had become weightless. When the feed returned, the camera was pointing upward. No one had moved it. The image showed the underside of the ship. Between the camera and the hull was a large dark oval. It was not an object with a visible surface. It looked like an absence in the water where the camera lights did not travel correctly. 6 pale marks appeared along one side. They remained for 2 frames. Then the screen went black. Gordon brought the camera back up. The housing was undamaged. A thin gray film covered the lens and cable for about 3 meters. It wiped away easily and smelled metallic. The tone did not return before sunrise. At 6:40, the captain contacted the company's shore office and reported an unexplained acoustic event with possible equipment interference. We were told to continue the survey but preserve all recordings. Sarah made 3 copies of the hydrophone data. One copy became unreadable before breakfast. The second contained only normal ocean noise. The third still held the rising tones, but the depth information had changed. Instead of starting at the seabed, the software placed the source above the ship from the beginning. That contradicted what all of us had watched live. The official review lasted 2 weeks. The company blamed a combination of whale calls, thermal layers, and equipment errors. The pressure event was listed as an unusual swell. No whale species was identified. There had been no swell large enough to lift the ship. The deck crew were told not to discuss it publicly because the route data belonged to the client. A month later, I returned for another rotation on the North Calder. The hydrophone array had been replaced. The new system worked normally for 6 days. On the 7th night, I was in the survey room with a technician named Priya Desai when a narrow line appeared at 3:07. It began deep. It rose steadily. Priya asked what she was seeing. Before I answered, the ship's internal phone rang. It was Ben on the bridge. He said 3 deckhands had reported hearing a faint whistle in the sky. The hydrophone tone reached sea level. Nothing appeared on the water. The sound continued upward. I ran to the outer deck. The cloud cover was low and broken that night. Stars showed through narrow gaps. A group of crew stood by the rail looking straight above the mast. The whistle faded somewhere overhead. As it passed into the cloud, the vapor bent around a long, invisible shape. For 2 seconds, the outline became clear. It was an oval larger than the ship standing upright in the sky. A row of dim patches ran along its lower edge. One patch darkened. Something narrow moved behind it. The cloud closed. The shape disappeared. The sea beneath us remained calm. On the hydrophone display, a new tone began at the top of the graph. It moved downward. The black object appeared at 10:41 in the morning, about 9 minutes before totality. I was standing in a dry pasture outside Casper, Wyoming, with my telescope aimed at the sun. The field belonged to a farmer who had rented spaces to eclipse visitors. There were cars, tents, folding chairs, and camera tripods spread across maybe 5 acres. My name was Colin Mercer. I was 38 and worked for a printing company in Boise. Astronomy was a hobby I had picked up after my divorce because it gave me something to do at night, besides sit in my apartment. I had driven down with my friend Alyssa Grant and her brother Ben. They were using cameras with long lenses. I had brought a small refractor telescope on a tracking mount, fitted with a proper solar filter over the front. The weather was almost perfect. The sky was clear, except for a few thin clouds near the eastern horizon. The wind came in light gusts that moved the dry grass around our ankles. The moon had already covered most of the sun. Through the telescope, the remaining part looked like a thick white crescent. I was adjusting the focus when a tiny black mark entered from the upper left. At first, I thought it was a bird. Birds crossed the telescope all the time. They usually appeared as quick, blurred shapes and disappeared before I could identify them. This one stayed sharp. It moved slowly across the bright part of the sun, heading down and to the right. The moon was moving in the opposite direction. I pulled away from the eyepiece and looked up through my eclipse glasses. I saw the sun, the dark bite of the moon, and nothing else. No plane, no bird, no balloon. I looked through the telescope again. The object was still there. It was very small compared with the sun, maybe the size of one of the larger sunspots, but darker and cleaner around the edges. It looked slightly oval, with one side flatter than the other. I called Alyssa over. "Can you check this?" She came to the telescope and looked through the eyepiece. "What am I looking for?" "There's a black thing crossing near the top." She watched for a few seconds. "I see 2 sunspots." "Not those. It's moving toward the center." She looked again. "I don't see anything moving." And I thought maybe the object had disappeared while she was looking, but when I checked, it had traveled farther across the sun. I asked Ben to look. He used the telescope for nearly 10 seconds. "Nothing," he said. "Just the crescent." I looked again. The object remained. It was not a spot in my eye. When I looked away, there was no dark mark in my vision. It was not dirt on the eyepiece either. I rotated the eyepiece, but the object kept moving in the same direction. I loosened the mount and shifted the telescope so the sun moved to the edge of the view. The black oval stayed against the sun. A bit of dust on the optics would have moved with the telescope view. This did not. I checked the filter for damage. It was secure and clean. The object continued toward the center of the visible crescent. Then it stopped. It did not slow gradually. 1 second it was moving, and the next it held completely still. I watched for maybe 5 seconds before checking the mount. The tracking motor made its usual quiet hum. The sun stayed centered. Nothing else appeared wrong. I leaned back to the eyepiece. The object had not moved. It sat near the middle of the remaining sunlight, perfectly black. The crowd around us became louder as totality approached. People called out times and adjusted cameras. A family nearby had music playing from a portable speaker. Children ran between the parked cars wearing paper eclipse glasses. All of that sounded normal, but I began feeling separated from it. My ears had a slight pressure in them, like I had driven up a steep hill too quickly. I swallowed. The pressure stayed. I took out my phone and held its camera over the eyepiece. After a few tries, I got the sun centered on the screen. The black object appeared on the phone. I could see it clearly. I started recording. "Alyssa," I said, "look at the screen." She leaned over my shoulder. "What?" "The dot in the center." She looked exactly where I pointed. "There's no dot." I thought she was messing with me. "It's right there. I see the sunspot near the edge." "Not that one." Ben looked too. He saw nothing. I turned the phone toward myself. The object was obvious, a small dark oval near the center, not touching the moon's edge or either sunspot. I took a screenshot. Alyssa stared at it. She said the image showed only the crescent. I asked a man at the next setup to check. His name was Gordon, and he had a large solar telescope with a monitor attached. He seemed annoyed, but came over. He looked through my telescope. "No moving object," he said. I checked his monitor. His image showed the same part of the sun, but no black oval. When I looked back into my own eyepiece, the